That would have been
Just
funny. Hello, my fellow historians. Greetings. We are back. I'm Aziz. With me is Ashea. And this is Valar Rereadis, where we look for the foreshadowing we missed, new depth in the world building, a better understanding of the plot lines, greater familiarity with the characters, and more fun than you can fit in all 7 hells. This week, it's the end of A Game of Thrones. We made it through the first book, 11 episodes, and we're through. Well, 10 if you're not counting this one, because we're not through it yet. We're just now starting. In this one, we've got Bran VII, the one where they go down into the crypts, aka the gang, gets a history lesson.
Sansa 6, the one where Joffrey makes her look, aka the gang browses heads.
Daenerys 9, the gang helps Dany recover, aka the one where she suffocates Drogo.
Tyrion 9, the gang hears about the Battle of the Camps, aka the one where Tywin yells, "They have my son."
And Jon 9, another 9, the one where Jon runs off, aka the gang rescues Jon from himself.
Catelyn 11, the gang gets loud about some king, aka the one where Robb gets promoted.
That sounds interesting. And Daenerys 10, the last chapter, the one where, whoa, holy crap, dragons, aka the gang hatches some eggs. Well, join us on Patreon if you can. There's some new bonus episodes start dropping this week. It'll be the Ned chapters. I first announced that we would have all each arc in one episode, which was kind of a silly thing to say. I shouldn't have expected to put all of the Ned chapters in one episode. That's 15 chapters, and we only do 7, and that's usually a week here. And that usually ends up being around 2 hours, if not more. So 15 Ned chapters turns out to be well over 4 hours. So we're going to split that in half. And then Arya will go up second. And that's only 5 chapters, so that won't be super long. That one will probably be under 2 hours. And the rest will all go up as well, each as a batch. All of those will be on Patreon as bonus episodes. I'm not sure what will go up after Arya. We'll put a TBA on the order of the rest of them, but y'all can weigh in if you have a particular order you'd like to see. We're not starting Clash of Kings right away. Next week, as I've said in the past, we're doing a Q&A, and it'll be full public instead of the semi-private live streams we've been doing for most of these episodes. And we'll have 2 excellent guests, Lady Gwyn of Radio Westeros and Joe Buckley of the Isle of Faces podcast, who has been contributing a lot of his thoughts and writings to these episodes as well. So with that in mind, some of the questions you all sent us this week will actually be answered next week instead. Some of them will be kind of answered both. I'll maybe give a few thoughts now and let Lady Gwyn and Sir Buckley weigh in next week. And of course, Ashea will have some thoughts on some of these questions as well. But we'll just have to see how that goes, see how many questions we get. But we'll definitely have a lot to say regardless of how many questions we get sent. We have quite a lot to say just from things that we didn't get to during the regular coverage of chapters. All right, that's all I have for announcements. Let's get right to it. Bran VII, the one where they go down into the crypts, a.k.a. the gang gets a history lesson. It's the one where they get news of Ned's death and dream of it beforehand. Maester Luwin continues to deny magical things are happening while teaching history lessons that involve magical things happening. We can see that some time has passed in a number of ways, but one of the most straightforward is the explanation that Osha has gained enough trust to have her chain removed, though she still wears shackles on her ankles. It's like a process of trust. You get each bit of chain removed and shackle removed a little bit at a time until you're finally, well, kind of free. Point being, she's closing the gap to where she can be trusted with such proximity to the Starks and all these other things. And they like her, really. She likes them, too. Why not? It's probably the best life she's had. At worst, it's a great opportunity for her. I mean, the gratitude of the Starks and maybe families like the Manderleys down the line is a pretty damn valuable thing. The first line of the chapter is thus.
The oldest were men grown, 17 and 18 years from the day of their naming. One was past 20. Most were younger, 16 or less.
So besides the young men getting their combat lessons from Roderick, which is what that's all about, Sir Roderick, excuse me, got to use the appropriate title there, Bran is getting more ruler lessons that they don't necessarily read that way if you're not looking out for it. But when you're looking out for it, as we are, it rings pretty clearly. Luwin tells him the reality of war and how so many men heading south won't return and that they need men to guard the walls ASAP. So, train them now so that if a threat comes, they'll be ready for it. Of course, it turns out when the threat comes, it's not enough, right? The Boltons get tricky and Sir Roderick leads some of these men away. Anyway, that's not the point. It's all reminiscent of A Feast for Crows, though, when Brienne hears about how young men are just so often brought into this life, into the war and battle with this expectation but with little actual understanding of what they're getting themselves into. On the other hand, with the others coming, no one is going to really regret being better at fighting than they were ahead of time. This isn't quite the same as all the wars that we normally see. Even though that's not what they're actually preparing for, it is what they're preparing for. They just don't know it. So along those lines, next to this soldiery bit stuff, don't take that the wrong way, soldier bits. Right away in this chapter, we get the comet. It's kind of sneaky, though. Quote.
The maester was peering through his big, mirrorish lens tube, measuring shadow. Sorry. You started chuckling. It's not even anything, but I could tell
His
you were...
big, mirrorish lens tube.
Yes. Measuring shadows and noting the position of the comet that hung low in the morning sky.
Now, that's interesting. That a lot of people didn't realize that this was one of the first mentions of the comet. There might be another mention of the comet during Bran's coma dream back in Bran 3. Quote, check this out.
He saw Maester Luwin on his balcony, studying the sky through a polished bronze tube and frowning as he made notes in a book. Also, I just want to say, Bran apparently learned that it was mirrorish.
Yes, in the meantime. Yeah, first it was just a polished bronze tube, and now he knows it's mirrorish. Yeah, you're right. The education of Bran is complete, right? Luwin is always teaching him things. How to polish his bronze tube. One day your mirrorish lens tube will be big like mine. Oh, boy. The comet obviously becomes a pretty big deal. And just as it seems to be part of the cause or effect of some kind of magical awakening or just a general magical backdrop, there's this mystery here. And we see the others awake before the comet, so I'm inclined to believe it's a sign and not a cause. But it can be both, too. That's magic for you. It doesn't have to conform to rules, and magic doesn't obey your rules. Stupid Lisa Science Queen. Magic Queen. Luwin Queen. What? I don't know. This is really starting off silly today, isn't it? A reason to think it's part of the cause of awakening old powers, as in the trigger rather than just a sign here, is it comes to us from the extended H.P. Lovecraft universe of all places. In a case of George R. R. Martin giving a clear nod, given the similarities, that is. Well, I'll explain what I'm talking about here. George R. R. Martin was friends with an author named Ramsey Campbell, an author who wrote a story in the Lovecraft universe called The Tugging. In this story, he created an elder god named Groth. That's G-H-R-O-T-H. I think I've talked about Groth before, but it's a good time to bring him up again. His nickname is the Harbinger, and hey, kind of like the comet, right? He's a moon-sized eye that can open and close. That's really creepy, isn't it? A gigantic moon-sized eye. Wow, right? So most of the time, it just looks like a wandering planet. But this planet happens to be red like rust, and it's constantly singing a cosmic song that awakens old powers on any planet that it passes near enough. So you can see the similarity, a red comet versus a red planet, and in both cases, arguably awakening ancient powers. Well, in Groth's case, definitely doing that. In the comet's case, maybe that's what's happening. And Lewin and Dany and everyone else sees this comet over time. So, a red celestial body, yeah, pretty similar concept, huh? Hat tip to Silas Toms, a.k.a. Loki_president on Twitter, who introduced me to this while doing a panel with Emmett Booth of Nauticast at Ice and FireCon a couple years ago. Anyway, this is no sure thing, of course, as close as that parallel is. There are some differences, too. Groth is rarely seen, like I said, while we just pointed out how basically everyone sees the comet and weighs in on what it probably means. And, of course, everybody has all these crazy ideas on what they think it means. At this point in the story, no one knows yet. And in Clash, well, people aren't going to know then either. There's just more opinions thrown around. So whether it heralds the others and magic in general, or is it the chicken, or is it the egg, or something else entirely, I'm kind of guessing that's one of those things we're never going to get a clear answer on. But there's a lot of interesting factors here. Lewin is wrong about this, about what it means, magic-wise. He's wrong about magic in a lot of ways here. But he's not entirely off base, because it seems to be true that magic has waned. Like, a lot of old powers didn't work the way they used to, and that's starting to come back. So there's a lot of uncertainty. But it's great foreshadowing for the magic in Bran's arc as well, which is also going to build, and how it's going to grow over time, and how it's going to relate to a lot of these Age of Heroes stories and figures that are part of this chapter. More certain, too, beyond all this, which is, like I said, pretty uncertain. You don't know. Magic is hard to figure. But the fact that Bran and Rickon had a shared dream, that's really hard to explain away. Though Lewin does try to, though he becomes more and more uncertain, especially down in the crypts, when, the reveal that they had the same dream, and then with Shaggy Dog and all this other stuff. Then we have a bloody raven showing up. And while Ocean knows what it is and says so, because she doesn't need any convincing about the old powers, Lewin also seems to know, even though he hasn't fully admitted it. He stares at the raven as if it were, quote, a scorpion with feathers, which is kind of crazy. Now, I'm not going to ask Ashay to read the rest of his reaction. It's just too damn sad.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Instead, let's talk about some of the other foreshadowing in this chapter. That's a lot more fun. Quote,
Sir Roderick should teach me to use a poleaxe. If I had a poleaxe with a big, long haft, Hodor could be my legs. We could be a knight together. I think that unlikely, Maester Lewin said. Bran, when a man fights, his arms and legs and thoughts must be as one.
Yeah, his other parts must be as one, too. His big, long haft must be as one.
I was really hoping I'd make you choke up on your drink there.
That was close. And about that, Bran's been taking over Hodor's body and controlling him entirely during A Dance with Dragons. So his thoughts are as one. Hodor kind of does the equivalent of sitting in the corner in his own brain, as we see there. It's kind of dark, but also kind of confirming what we're seeing here 4 books earlier. And almost as certain as Maester Lewin being consistently wrong about anything magical, well, he's basically right about everything else, so let's not be too harsh on him. He also, meaning Bran, mentions Simeon Star Eyes, who fought with a twin-bladed staff and had star sapphires for eyes. The eyes part really sounds others-like. Blue eyes, shining star eyes, that's really others-y. And it's not the only time Simeon is mentioned, which is... Well, let's think about that. We love our It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia and Friends style chapter titles, but in this case, I think of that old Seinfeld tropey joke thing. What's the deal with Simeon Star Eyes? I ask because, like I said, he comes up a lot, alongside names like Brandon the Builder, Night's King, and Serwyn of the Mirror Shield, i.e. figures from the Age of Heroes. But he's also been mentioned alongside contemporary heroes like Aemon the Dragon Knight and Ryan Redwine. So these are characters that lived only 100, 200 years ago. So he's mentioned Simeon Star Eyes early in the books, i.e. here, in A Game of Thrones, several times. And again in the later books, Feast and Dance, but also in The Hedge Knight and The World of Ice and Fire. So that's hanging over us for now then. It makes sense that it will have something to do with Bran's arc, but maybe not, maybe not. The Crypts history lesson we get here in this chapter is really fun. I love that. We get a mix of heroic figures in the same vein as these Age of Heroes figures. Some of them might even have been contemporary. Some of them are more recent, like Cregan Stark, who lived a very long life after the dance ended. His nickname was the Old Man in the North. And we don't know when he died, but he was probably in his 70s or 80s. And his ancestor, Torrhen Stark, the king who knelt to Aegon the Conqueror about 300 years ago, we see him as well. That's maybe more of a parallel to Jon Snow if we go by what we see in the show. Some other possibly noteworthy ones, Theon Stark, the Hungry Wolf, constantly at war. Interesting. A Rickard Stark, who married the Marsh King's daughter. A lot of people wondering about the Marsh King and how the Crannogmen may have children of the forest blood and how that may have gotten in the Stark bloodline, which might explain some of the skin changing and green seeing powers that we're seeing in this generation. And then there's Jon Stark, who built the Wolf's Den at White Harbor. And to continue the pattern of repeated names, Theon, Rickard, Jon, we have Brandon the Burner and Brandon the Shipwright mentioned as well, which might, that makes us think of Arya, as we've said before. And of course, of great importance, Bran points out the statues of Brandon and Lyanna, his aunt and uncle, beside their father, Lord Rickard. All three of these characters, we have lots of questions about, especially Lyanna. So lots of, hopefully we get more revealed about their past and the stuff that happened building up to the rebellion and during it. Now, Bran feels a great sadness as he approaches their statues. And Bran repeats what Robert Baratheon, early on, that Lyanna was raped by Rhaegar. So a reminder that most people believe that version, even, Bran, even Ned's own family. Shaggy Dog's sudden attack in the darkness is, in its own way, maybe a bit of a clue what it will be like to be in the crypts when the dead rise. Shaggy is, in a sense, Stark rage personified, given Rickon is channeling his feelings and energy into his direwolf. And, well, he's an angry kid. And that's important. A final example of what might be foreshadowing comes in this exchange between Bran and Luwin when Bran asks about the children of the forest. Quote,
"What do you wish to know?" "Everything."
"Oh, everything." Well, hooking yourself into the Weirwood network and gaining all those memories of the children, well, that's basically everything, if not literally everything. Maybe he wants to stop short of learning all about your big, long haft. Maybe not literally everything. Let's not quite learn everything, but everything about the children of the forest. Yeah, that's
maybe
cool.
not about how beautiful certain characters looked that night.
I think it's fair to say the show didn't do a great job with Bran's personality at the end. You can see how overwhelming having knowledge of everything would be. It might turn you into someone who comes off cold and distant, someone who doesn't think of themselves as a Stark anymore, or as a person, or as the person they were born as. Someone who's lost a lot of their humanity. So while that may have been a challenge that the show didn't pull off great, I think it is not necessarily wrong in terms of what they were aiming to do. I think we might see something similar from Bran very late in his arc. A couple random questions that I have and that you have.
Yeah, I wanted to take note of this quote, which made me think of Rickon on Skagos. Quote, "Rickon patted Shaggy Dog's muzzle, damp with blood. I let him loose. He doesn't like chains. He licked at his fingers." Which, with the whole cannibalism and all that on Skagos, whether it's a Shaggy Dog story or not, it makes you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big puzzle to me because obviously George decided initially to name him Shaggy Dog as if he wasn't going to be important. But we know the tale has grown in the telling. I kind of doubt when he named Rickon's dog Shaggy Dog, I doubt he had this plan for Rickon to go to Skagos or any of this stuff. I kind of imagine that was all added later. So Shaggy Dog may be foreshadowing as a name.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good question you ask here. The Rickon is, He's pretty aggressive, isn't he? He's an interesting kid, not in the bad way, but he's wild. You know, he hasn't been parented as much as his rest of his family, and
Yeah,
well,
I don't know. I think it's pretty weird to lick your bloody fingers as a 4-year-old, but I guess that's a young enough age that you could give him a pass. But yeah.
So next question we have from Eric on Flick. In Bran's dream, Ned was sad about Jon, he points out. Since Jon was on Ned's mind a lot when he was down in the Black Cells, perhaps that's what Bran was picking up on. Maybe it was the last thing on Ned's mind as he was being executed, like a regret. One of his many regrets is that he's never going to get to tell Jon the truth about himself. And if Bran is, has this psychic sensitivity, whatever you want to call it, then yeah, it makes sense he would pick up on that. Good catch by Eric. Eric also wants us to talk about the issue of Rickon having the same dreams, and what does that mean? Well, one great idea that's been around the fandom for a while also relates to H.P. Lovecraft, which is that Lovecraft's style was that he would have these ancient evil beings. Let's take the story of the Call of Cthulhu, where when Cthulhu arises, when he wakes up from his ancient slumber, it sends out these kind of waves. It's not described that way, but basically people around Earth start having dreams, but only like the sensitive types, like the artistic, creative types, the most extreme of those type of people would start having dreams. Like they were picking it up, like it was like a radio signal almost, and they were receivers. And so if we use that concept, maybe Bloodraven or whoever was sending out this signal looking for people who could receive it, and then those people who answered, he started, communicating with them. Whether Rickon and Bran both fall into that category, well, they probably do, or whether Euron does as well is kind of an open question. It makes sense that if Bloodraven or the beings within the Werewood network are looking for the next Green Seer, that they would have multiple candidates. They wouldn't just be one, it could just be the one, but this evidence seems to point in another direction, especially if we throw Euron in the mix like we did. So it could be the same concept of having an heir and a spare, right? He could be, Rickon could be the spare. It doesn't look like he'll be needed. Bran seems to have gone far enough along the path to be the next Green Seer. But it's an interesting concept, and some of the early magic here still makes us think. And of course, the Bloody Raven itself mixes all into this. If it's not clear what I mean by that, the raven that delivers the news of Bran and Rickon's father's death is bloody. So, Blood Raven, there's no certainty. In fact, it's not super likely that George picked this moment to reference Bloodraven, because he may not have given Bloodraven that name yet, but he may have looked back on this moment and decided to build from this moment and saying, hey, I made this bloody raven here. Why not call the character Bloodraven? It's not necessary to think that, he couldn't have possibly had that name in mind, even though, because we know he didn't. But he may have had, a short list of names that involved that concept. Stefan Buman asks, how do the Long Night timeline, books, and show work out? Do they contradict each other? I don't think they contradict each other. Well, it depends on what you mean by contradict. I don't think they do. I wouldn't say they contradict each other. They have similar framework, but the timelines are a bit different. However, the timelines are hazy in both cases, so there's room for them to end up kind of similar if we learn the truth, that is. I kind of doubt we ever will, but we'll probably have more clarity than we do now, even if we don't get the full answers. Tree Girl asks an interesting question. Hodor is afraid of going down in the crypts and wonders if this is where he'll be holding the door. If the crypts of Winterfell explode with undead rising, well, it could make sense that they're trying to escape the crypts and someone has to hold them in.
I had the same thought when I was reading, and I did wonder. I mean, they get him to go in the crypts eventually, though.
They do,
but they also
not in this chapter, but eventually, yeah.
Yeah, and he doesn't seem overly freaked out about the cave, if that's the memory. So I don't know.
It's a good, I like the theory. And to add to it, the idea that a door would be in Bloodraven's cave is a little strange. Although, to be fair, there is a spot where one of the exits is described as a door, even though it doesn't have a door on it. So the setup is there for either of these to work. Another candidate is the Black Gate, the Night Fort, but I don't know how you would hold that one because it's a magical door. Still, there are other doors possible, but I like the idea of the crypts. It's a good one. Nina Friel points out that Lewin gets some props for how he talks about Hodor, because Hodor is, handicapped, and Lewin does not condone treating him as a lesser being. And Bran doesn't, to be fair, so it's good. Bran, it shows that Bran has that proper sensibility. He's tempted because he's a boy, and he's not fully in control of himself. He's a bit sad. He's a tragic figure, but he still has that goodness in him. He still has that mercy, that love, that dignity for other living things. And Lewin also endeavors to teach Bran about magic despite his own lack of belief in the subject. He's just a good kind of father figure, a good character.
I appreciated this little line about the children. It also mentions weirwood bows.
Yeah.
Male and female hunted together with weirwood bows and flying snares. I like hearing about their culture in general. So yeah, that's nice.
Yeah. There's some discussion on Flick. Again, Flick is a great little community we have going that grows every week. Discussions of the chapters and great questions being asked. Each chapter is its own post, and that's all there is, basically. Just chapter posts and one or two other things occasionally.
Yeah, it's a great alternative to those of you that don't want to be on Facebook or Twitter, which is completely reasonable to not want to be on social media.
Yeah. There's no, it's kind of closed in that sense. You're not open to a bunch of random people. It's just people from this group.
Yeah, and you could have emailed us, of course, but it's nice to have that back and forth in a chat.
Yeah. So one of the discussions on Flick this time around was the significance of Lyanna and Brandon not being lords yet having statues. Well, there's a little funny background here from us on this. It's a question that I certainly had. And back in 2013 or early 2014, I got to ask him a question, and I had a couple questions in mind, and the Q&A started to run long. So they told us while I was still in line, hey, no long questions. It has to be a yes or no question. So, well, that kind of settled it for me. I had to go with the question of mine that was a yes or no question. So I asked, George, was Archos the Implacable ever Lord? And he said no. Now, by late 2014, we got that officially in the World of Ice and Fire family tree.
Great question, Aziz.
Yeah, I asked one that we ended up learning about eventually anyway. Wah, wah, wah. But the point is that Lyanna and Brandon weren't the first one. George decided to add precedent prior to Ned. And possibly there's precedent before that, even though we don't know about it. But it makes sense that, you're Lord of Winterfell. You can do what you want. You're King of Winterfell. You can break tradition if you want. It's just not likely to happen, but it's not some sort of blasphemy or anything like that. John Hagee asks regarding the lens tube. He shows great interest in the Mirish lens tube. he actually, it's a really good question. Is this the same Mirish lens that was sent with Lysa's message to Catelyn?
Well, I think if it's Lysa's message to Catelyn that Lysa has one herself, I think it makes a lot of sense for various castles to have it. There's like one part where they talk about Rickon was using the lens tube to look at the gargoyles. So I think it's a useful thing to see enemies in the distance, to be honest.
That's a good point.
In the Vale, that seems extra
I wonder,
relevant.
Yeah, right. What are you going to look at? You're going to look at try to see if Alyssa's tears hit the ground. Like, look, it's really happening. Yeah, that's a good point. I wonder if the tube will... it may have just been destroyed when Ramsay sacked Winterfell. But if not, you could see, maybe they could see the others coming from far away. Yeah, you wonder about that. I think it is probably the same Mirish lens that was sent with Lysa's message. But I had not thought about that.
Theon does look through the Mirish lens tube, by the way.
He does?
Yeah, he does. He looks at the banners. Using it, so it's clearly like it's useful for things other than comets and the stars
and euphemisms.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. Sansa 6, the one where Joffrey makes her look, aka the gang browses heads, aka the one where Sansa starts to get her snark back. Snark, not Stark. Sansa snark, all that. The one where she starts thinking about jumping twice. Once by herself, once by taking Joffrey with her. And Sandor starts to show even more gentleness amidst quite a lot of cruelty. So that's an interesting development that we are we like to see, and we still wonder where it's going to wind up 4 books later. Arya had Yoren, but no one stopped Sansa from seeing Ned killed. She instead gets Pycelle coming in to molest her and give dubious medicine. So we have quite a parallel from Lewin being a fantastic maester, and other sad maesters like Crescent will be coming up soon, and we'll have Maester Aemon, of course. But Pycelle, no one ever that I know of ever feels sorry for him. He's creepy, he's gross, he's abusive here, and, well, he's also just... well, we'll get more to him later. We'll see. So here's how this chapter starts. Quote,
"In the tower room at the heart of Maegor's holdfast, Sansa gave herself to the darkness."
Oof.
Yeah, very sad.
Yeah.
Also, all the more fitting that it's in the heart of Maegor's holdfast, given the depression and all that associated with Maegor and his brides, I think.
That's a really good. I agree with that. It's this opening line is really powerful, and the fact that it's Maegor's heart, holdfast, the heart of Maegor's black heart, Maegor's evil, Maegor's cruel, all that. Yeah, it's George is really good with these single sentences. Sometimes these opening lines, I feel like, why are we just quoting the opening line only? But most of the time, I'm like, damn, this one line by itself is incredible. So she's having nightmares of various kinds, but mostly of them coming for her. Them is kind of a vague them. And when they do, we see how incredibly awful Joffrey can be. I tried to combine awful and Joffrey into one word there. Awful. What he's done prior to this chapter, at least to Sansa, is overwhelmed by what he does in this one. I mean, he's bad before this one, but this is where he kind of ascends to a new level of terrible. I mean, look how bad, like, there's small and large examples here. He demands to know what she's getting him for his name day while they're still standing there under her father's severed head, which he's just made her look at. I mean, damn, Joff. Remember that George originally planned for Sansa to stay with the Lannisters after bearing some of Joff's kids, which is referenced in this chapter via him crudely asking, when will you be ready to bear children? And we're not sure if this was part of the plan, meaning whether... when George originally came up with all this, whether he was going to have this type of abuse in mind for her, whether it was going to be part of her conflict, whether she was going to stay with her kids that she had with Joff, or whether go back with her family or not. And, you know, you can see so much on both sides of that, being with her kids, but being with Joff. Yeah. Either way, a lot of this is George R. R. Martin setting up these characters for a Clash of Kings. Sansa, most of all, of course, still young and with a lot to learn about the world around her, but far, far wiser than she was, 6 chapters ago when her arc began. Many of her illusions have been shattered abruptly. Quote,
"There are no heroes," and she remembered what Lord Peter had said to her here in this very hall. "Life is not a song, sweetling," he'd told her. "You may learn that one day to your sorrow." In life, the monsters win, she told herself, and now it was the hound's voice she heard, a cold rasp, metal on stone.
On top of that, she's being very rudely introduced to the idea / the concept that she's a commodity to these people. It's her claim that matters. Not unlike how Dany's arc began, but her magical protector is gone, i.e. Lady, while Dany's magical protectors are just about to be born. So they have a very different path to power here. Of course, the other characters around Sansa will be important in the short and or long terms as well. In this chapter, there's Sandor and Joffrey kind of filling themselves out as characters, but we also get more minor characters like Sir Meryn Trant. Now, he had a brutal death in the show, but he didn't even go to Braavos in the books, so something else is going to happen with him. Last we see of Meryn, he's guarding Hand of the King Mace Tyrell at the night of the final chapter, Kevin's epilogue. It's hard to see him surviving the series, this knight who is no true knight, but we don't know what is going to take him out and when.
Do you think we'll see that far, I mean, not that it's hard, I don't know, he's already very dark. Do you think we'll see that even darker side to him?
I wonder if we'll get the chance. Yeah, I kind of...
Or if he just took the place of what Arya's doing in Braavos, because he's a character that we know already.
Yeah, I think he was kind of just a character we knew already, but I wouldn't be surprised.
He's certainly not a good man who's willing to do that, but I don't know that he's specifically like very, very malicious like that. Or
yeah, he's more like he just, like she says about him is that he just doesn't care.
Yeah,
exactly. He's like he's just completely apathetic.
Yeah, and I don't know if he's just apathetic in general or apathetic, he has to be apathetic because he's getting paid off and or what benefits he's getting. I don't know.
Yeah, it seems like he'll be not more sympathetic, but different, if anything. But maybe he just won't be that important.
Yeah.
Now, her thoughts of jumping. This is interesting. It reminds us of the two different Dance of the Dragons era Targaryen princesses who, well, they may not have jumped. They may have been thrown. But Jaehaera and Helena did both die in this manner. And, of course, TV Tommen, who certainly jumped. And, yeah, it makes me think of some other people as well. Sansa's, we'll see what happens. She thinks of herself as a little bird, repeating the words they taught me, she says, just like the Hound says. She's kind of mocking herself and realizing that he was right. But we know little bird has another meaning to Varys, and his little birds are taught a very specific code, which they use to repeat things back to him. So it's kind of a little parallel there. The meanings are closer than they may have seemed in this case. And birds, well, they don't fall to their deaths. Well, rarely. And Varys is, of course, aware that Sansa's outlook, aware of Sansa's outlook and how she will be valued by others in the Game of Thrones, meaning that she's a commodity, that her claim matters. So he places a value on her as well. In the final scene, when they go ahead browsing, Sansa looks in every direction. She sees the same sun her mother saw when leaving the twins, though it's obscured by the city. Quote,
"To the west, the swollen red sun was half hidden behind the gate of the gods."
And perhaps more importantly, she looks north, knowing Winterfell is so far away she can't even see it, but she knows it's there. Then Joff commands her to look at her father's head. This reminds me of what could be in store for Book Littlefinger, especially taking in mind the Winterfell she makes out of snow with the giant's head as a trophy. The elements are all there. Sansa high atop the world looking down, the power of life and death in her hands, the severed heads, the gaze towards and thoughts of home. It's a perfect place to set up what's coming. Maybe we'll see Littlefinger's head on a spike at Winterfell. Giant's head, remember, Littlefinger's original family sigil is this Titan of Braavos, which is a giant. He takes the Mockingbird sigil for himself. Now, the final line of the chapter is, quote,
"Thank you," she said when he was done. "She was a good girl and always remembered her courtesies."
So that is quite a way to end her first set of chapters. It's an interesting summary and also tells you what's coming, because it's in its own way it's portentous. Knowing how much he's going to use courtesy, not just as armor, which is, a lady's armor is her courtesy, but also as a weapon. She's going to learn that, just like a shield can be used as a weapon, so can this concept of courtesy. A couple random questions here. Recall that Jon Snow orders Janos Slynt thrown down on the block and chops his head off. Here's a pretty iconic line in the fandom. Iconic.
Yeah, we would be remiss if we didn't at least quote this, but it's been discussed a bunch. Frog-faced Lord Slynt sat at the end of the council table wearing a black velvet doublet and a shiny cloth of gold cape, nodding with approval every time the king pronounced a sentence. Sansa stared hard at his ugly face, remembering how he had thrown down her father for Ser Ellen to behead, wishing she could hurt him, wishing that some hero would throw him down and cut off his head.
Now, some people call this foreshadowing, because originally when that scene of Lord Slynt's execution was written, it wasn't his head being chopped off. So some people will call this foreshadowing, because even though it actually worked out. But perhaps in the rewriting of that moment, it's because George realized that he could make this connection. So maybe it was intentional, just a late catch by the editor or by George himself. I'm not really clear on that. Either way, it works out. It parallels and lines up nicely. With his frog face, I wonder if Janos Slynt was tempted to eat Joffrey's fat worm lips, as Sansa calls them. Fat worm lips. Twice in this chapter, she thinks of his lips as wormy.
We've got one of Sansa's first of many snarky replies to Joffrey with, quote, After my name day feast, I'm going to raise a host and kill your brother myself. That's what I'll give you, Lady Sansa, your brother's head." Kind of madness took over her then, and she heard herself say, "Maybe my brother will give me your head."
Oh, ayo.
In addition, we already touched on this, and it's a hard subject to get into. I think it's something that really deserves its own time. But it's a really real depiction of depression we see from Sansa here. From just her sleeping and not being able to eat or clean herself. And just in general, I don't think we should get fully into it, but good job to George for writing this. It makes me wonder, about his own past.
Yeah, he may have, had some depression of his own he battled. It would be normal for a person to do that. He's had a long life.
I think most people have experienced some form of it.
Yeah. Stefan B. from Flick points out that there's a little bit of a reverse of things happening here. No one would speak to Sansa when things were all going astray and chaotic in the capital, and her father was being taken and his household was being killed. And now she speaks to no one. It's kind of she wanted to know what was happening, to talk to people, and now no. The opposite. Warren, the Celtic Hedge Knight, has a great quote here that he posted on our Facebook group. He says that initially she fits the damsel in distress trope, but the way she disarms Sandor shows that there is a strength in her courtesy, a strength which she is growing into. It's a fascinating read. You could say Sansa is like a little Red Riding Hood, except our girl isn't afraid of wolves. She is one. That's a good way to wrap up Sansa 6. Thanks for that, Warren. Daenerys 9. The gang helps Dany recover, a.k.a. the one where she suffocates Drogo. Arguably, this is the most important chapter of the batch this time. There's so much in it. There's so much to look back on. There's so much magic and mystery. The symbolism and foreshadowing of this chapter stand in full opposition to the idea that these ending chapters are mostly resolution and setup for later. There's a lot of reasons to come back to this chapter and wonder at what's going on, to look at the magic. Yeah, I think it might be the most important of all the Dany chapters. In terms of first-time readers, the Birth of the Dragons, you could argue, is more important. But on reread, this is the one that I think requires and encourages the most second, third, fourth looks, the most poring over the text. There's the peak of her dragon dreaming, the visions of what appear to be her ancient ancestors, as well as futures that will never be. The Red Door is majorly prominent again. And with the knowledge we have about her future now, with the end of the TV show, a lot of this is way darker than it looked. And it looked pretty dark. We were kind of fooled by the character we thought we were getting. We didn't see it all. We were focused on how this fire would be arrayed against the others in winter, and we didn't look past that. We didn't not everyone, but most of us didn't maybe foresee how all that afterwards would foreshadow more destruction. And there's a good bit of it here. It reads so much differently with all that in mind. A lesson here, too. Fire, right? This is ice and fire. It's the Song of Ice and Fire. Song of Ace and Fire? Song of Ice and Fire. But the great ancient enemy north of the wall is ice personified. So where's the ancient fire enemy? Well, right here. The dragons. They're fire-made flesh. There's also R'hllor and some of these other things, but Dany is supposedly the actual prophet, the actual messiah of R'hlliorism. So the destructive capabilities here of fire need to be remembered. This is a Song of Ice and Fire. Ice isn't the only enemy here. So that was the clue that I think a lot of us maybe didn't quite fully grasp. So let's look at how it starts. The chapter begins thusly.
Wings shadowed her fever dreams.
Isn't that putting it mildly? The wings are more than shadowing it. They flat out appear. And her dreams contain heat and shadow in spades. The phrase, "don't want to wake the dragon," appears 6 times, followed by "want to wake the dragon," then "wake the dragon," then just "the dragon." Between each of these 9 repetitions, there's a dream, or a piece of a dream. After all those dreams, Jiki says, "Khaleesi?" to mark the end of the dreaming, as if to say the dragon awakening is her, she, Khaleesi. But also, literal dragons are about to awaken in Dany's final chapter. So this is the setup for that. Let's look at these dreams now. These are fever dreams, but they're also magical fever dreams, it's fair to say. And notice how they contrast a bit to Bran's coma dreams early in the books, because she's kind of in not a coma, but she's out, coma-like state. But even more importantly, her fever dreams at the end of A Dance with Dragons, which when we get to, we'll take a closer look at the parallels. But for those who have maybe read that more recently, you may have noticed just how much this chapter, not this chapter, but her final chapter in that book and the final chapter in this book line up. The two sequences of dreams have a lot in common. First off, right away, we get this quote.
She was walking down a long hall beneath high stone arches. She could not look behind her, must not look behind her. There was a door ahead of her, tiny with distance, but even from afar, she saw that it was painted red. She walked faster, and her bare feet left bloody footprints on the stone.
The red door, of course, stands out, grabs our attention, but don't miss the blood on stone part here. She's about to raise dragons from stone with blood magic, but I don't know if that's what's being referenced. I think it's more of a trail of blood, like a path of destruction, kind of like the Khalasar ripping up the landscape behind her. Kind of the same kind of symbolism there. The red door, let's do talk about that. Like I said, it comes up quite a lot in this book. Only a few times in Clash and Storm, but it does come up. And of course, she's not in Feast, but it pops up again quite a bit in Dance. There's a lot of debating over this door and what it means about her past. In real life, red doors are almost always a good thing historically and throughout a lot of different cultures. For example, in Chinese and American culture, it can mean welcome or shelter offered. I read that in Scotland, it can mean that you paid off your mortgage, which that's kind of random, but it's certainly a good thing. Some people think that since lemon trees can't grow in Braavos, that the red door is elsewhere. Well, there's big problems with that theory, or with those related set of theories, which is, for one thing, it's a sure thing that the Sea Lord of Braavos signed a pact in Braavos with the Red Viper and Willem Darry present. And in this pact, of course, they agreed that Arianne would marry Viserys. Also, it's explicitly said that the rich and powerful, aka in specifically the Gardens of the Mighty, can have fruit trees in Braavos. So there is, precedent for the climate issue being having a resolution. On the other hand, to be fair, George R. Martin has been cagey about Dany's memory of the door when asked about it. So there is some wiggle room here, but it doesn't mean that the red door wasn't in Braavos or that they weren't in Braavos. Maybe they were in Braavos and then moved on to somewhere else. Well, actually, yes, they definitely did that. It's supposedly after they were kicked out of the house with the red door, they went to all over Myr and Tyrosh and etc. If we look at her batch of dreams as a group, the red door appears in several of them, as is the notion that she can't get to it, that it's, quote, farther away than ever, and, quote, so far ahead of her. It's a part of her childhood, but when she does get close, it vanishes and turns into something not so childlike or innocent at all, quote.
The door loomed before her, the red door, so close, so close. The hall was a blur around her, the cold receding behind. And now the stone was gone, and she flew across the Dothraki Sea, high and higher, the green rippling beneath, and all that lived and breathed fled in terror from the shadow of her wings.
Well, that last line certainly reminds us of the rule by fear doctrine Dany believes she has no choice but to adopt at the end of the TV show. The dragon feeds on horse and sheep alike, indeed. And indeed, again, the Dothraki Sea is the place she'll become the mother of dragons. So when this dream says she's flying across the Dothraki Sea high and higher, well, not only is she becoming the mother of dragons shortly, but she will be flying over the Dothraki Sea in A Dance with Dragons when she actually finally mounts Drogon. So another idea, this is one Ashea and I had recently, very recently, and we're probably not the first one to think of it, but anyway, the idea is the red door maybe is nowhere. Maybe it wasn't in Braavos or anywhere else. It's just a false memory from her childhood, and it's not that she had it somewhere else. Perhaps it's just a memory only, something that she invented in her head. It's possible. There's problems with all the red door theories, basically. Everything has a small flaw to it. So no matter where you land on it, you have to acknowledge that all the theories have small things at least might be wrong. So hopefully we get more clarity on that. I suspect we will. But it's interesting to point out that the show didn't go there at all. The red door really, they used the bells in kind of a different way, but the red door, I don't recall if they mentioned it at all. And they certainly didn't make a thing of it at near the end of her arc. So that's a good thing, because we still have that mystery left unrevealed to us. Either way, as much as it represents her past, it also definitely seems to represent her future. Maybe George was playing with the fact that a red door usually means a good thing. For those people who know that symbolism, most of us just didn't know. But for people who did, maybe it was a way to kind of fool them a bit. But red, it just seems like fire and blood. Just this path of destruction that she seems to be on. or a home she'll never reach, or both. So, again, keeping the TV series finale in mind, there's some quotes within this dream sequence that are also really striking and more ominous than they even were before. For example,
suddenly the stars were gone, and across the blue sky swept the great wings, and the world took flame.
The world took flame. Well, that one stands out right now because when I got Michael Klarfeld's world map signed at Worldcon this past month.
World map signed at Worldcon.
That's right. That's the place to do it, apparently, right? George, he signed the map. He thought it was really cool. He loved Michael Klarfeld's maps. Check out our episode live stream that we did a little while back on our stories from Ireland. It's YouTube only because there's lots of videos and images in it. Well, George R. Martin joked with me about the world map, saying soon it would all be on fire. So the world took flame in this quote. I thought he was joking a bit, but maybe he was sort of only half joking. Either way, it was... well, that was quite a moment. Now, here's another one that stands out even more than it did before, and it already stood out quite a bit.
A great knife of pain ripped down her back, and she felt her skin tear open and smelled the stench of burning blood and saw the shadow of wings. And Daenerys Targaryen flew.
The shadow of wings, that one comes up a lot, huh?
Yeah, burning blood.
Yeah, all that. All this blood and wings and shadow and dragon. Yeah, it's just... The repeated imagery here is so powerful. Growing her own wings, though, that's... well, you got to think of that moment on TV when Dany and Drogo are lined up in that shot where it looks like she has wings. That really makes me think about that. It's part of that duality, that she really is part dragon. She is literal dragon in at least some part way. And a reminder that, you know, we're focused on the evidence that she's going to be this force of destruction. I'm calling this path of destruction, all this devastation, all this death. Because that's the new thing to us. That part's the shocking reveal that we, 20 years of most of us not thinking about that. We were more focused, like I said at the beginning of this chapter, of how she's going to fight the others. We weren't wrong about that. She is almost certainly going to fight the others, and she's almost certainly going to be crucial to that. She's going to save humanity, most likely. That's still true. So we haven't lost sight of that. It's just that stuff isn't the new part to us. So let's not forget that in these dreams, there's also these features of her dual role as savior and enemy. Because the darkness and cold are still a big deal, and she is, of course, going to be a part of stopping that. Quote,
she could feel the icy breath behind sweeping up on her. If it caught her, she would die a death that was more than death, howling forever alone in the darkness.
Ooh, that's an interesting concept that maybe...
it really makes you think of whites and all that, I think.
Right?
Yeah.
Do they still have more? Do they have more of their mind than we think? And they're, like trapped and like Hodor.
Yeah,
like how they're just
yeah.
cowering in the corner of their own minds, unable to... that would be horrible. What a reveal that would be. And, well, I certainly wouldn't put that past George. In fact, I almost think that it's likely from a certain perspective. So let's not forget that the theme seems to be that, yeah, Dany intends good and justice and ending slavery and things like that. But it looks like she'll go too far in some of these goals. And her power is so great that it can doom as easily as it saves, because it's fire. It gets out of control. The conceptual, thematic way to look at fire is that, yeah, sure, it can help to destroy the others, but after that, it's going to keep burning. And, what else will it burn? And last week, we talked about how bravery is good, but being truly fearless is maybe not such a great thing. So here's a sign of that I never really put into proper context. Quote,
her fingers trailed lightly across the surface of the shell, tracing the wisps of gold, and deep in the stone, she felt something twist and stretch in response. It did not frighten her. All her fear was gone, burned away.
So, all her fear was gone. I said that's not a good thing. And she seemed to be pretty fearless, before. There was magical fear powder that Miri threw, and it didn't work on her. She felt it, but she resisted. Now, if that happens, it sounds like she wouldn't have even felt it. It would just be, there would be no fear at all. There's nothing to frighten her. So this is after all that intense dreaming, of course. But before, she's consciously aware of Rhaego's loss. Nor has she been told what state Drogo is in. a few moments later, she does think of her son, but in retrospect, this is more ominous too. It's played off a bit as her subconscious is, it's kind of made out that she kind of already knew Rhaego was dead. She just didn't want to admit it yet. But a lot of it's just this destiny and trauma and this lack of fear anymore. There are signs that she has less feeling than she, quote, maybe should have for having lost a child. Quote,
she felt sad, and yet she could feel Rhaego receding from her as if he had never been.
Yeah, that's kind of like, geez, you're already getting over your child's death that quickly. I don't know, that seems that's interesting. Anyway, perhaps fear wasn't the only thing that was burned out of her. Also, this grief and, this constant theme of Dany, if I look back, I'm lost. And, what's looking back? Grief and trauma are a form of looking back. It's a metaphor, a metaphorical way of looking back, but it's a straightforward metaphor, looking back on your past and the things that harmed you. Well, if Dany just can somehow block all of that out, that's not normal. You got to deal with, most people, we have to deal with our trauma. We have to deal with these awful losses. You can't just forget about it, have it burned out of you. That's something else. When she's feverish too, she wants a dragon egg. She crawls toward the eggs, and then when they stop her from crawling, from exerting herself too much, she still asks for them, or one of them. She's not asking for her child. She's not asking for Drogo. She asks for a dragon egg. So she's driven, right? This is more than just confidence and knowing. There's something magical here. But it's so powerful and overwhelming, and it's in her. Jorah wonders if she means to kill herself when she's setting up the pyre later. And she does not, but she is willing to do something that should kill her by all rights. Now, she wonders why she hadn't thought of her son. At some point, she does have that realization, and then she remembers her dream of future Rhaego and how he bursts into flames, which is kind of symbolic of a man who never was. He turns into ash and all that. The dream of Rhaego and what he could have been is almost sweet, but the reality is, quote, monstrous, as Miri Mazdur puts it. And further, she says, quote,
twisted, I drew him forth myself. He was scaled like a lizard, blind, with the stub of a tail and small leather wings like the wings of a bat. When I touched him, the flesh sloughed off the bone, and inside he was full of grave worms and the stink of corruption. He had been dead for years. What years? I just have to say, years. That's not how long you have a baby.
Yeah, it's so weird, right?
I don't know.
I mean, George builds the mystery, but also increases the mystery, because we see lizard baby types from Visenya, the daughter of Rhaenyra, and monstrosities sired by Maegor the Cruel, and there's a couple other maybe examples. And in those, we see wings and being blind and eyeless, and we see other tails. But in none of those examples are there grave worms and corruption and this time lapse thing.
And just the flesh just coming off the bone.
Yeah, I mean, the shadow, I guess what we're seeing is the shadow. She's called these ancient shadows, and they've taken over Rhaego or became him. Or that's where the Tyrion time traveling fetus theory comes from.
Actually,
this mention of
Brian
being
E
dead
said
for
something
years.
about that in the chat. He said she got over it so quickly because deep down she knew that he had successfully traveled back in time several decades and safely arrived in Joanna Lannister's womb.
If you don't know what the heck we're talking about, look up the D plus D equals T, which is, yes, Dany plus Drogo equals Tyrion. That is the time traveling fetus theory. It's, of course, as silly as it sounds, but very entertaining. So worth checking out for that entertainment value. So with those other examples we get from Visenya and Maegor's kids, if you want to call them that, there's no talk of, none of this other stuff. There's no grave worms, none of that. So, but there are some other interesting parallels, or at least common elements, similarities. In little Visenya's case, we hear there was a hole where her heart should have been. And in Dany's dream here, Rhaego's heart burst into flame. Is that meant to be a reference? I don't know. R'hllor is certainly in Dany's future, and the flaming heart fits that. It's not how all that connects here, but the elements are there, so I want to draw your attention to it. And again, as we've been saying for several chapters now, we're trying to get at Miri's intent and what she's intended here, whether she's claiming victory for things that she didn't actually do. It's something we'll talk about a little bit more next week when we have Joe Buckley and Lady Gwyn to weigh in, and the Q&A if you're listening to this in some other order. Here's a quote from Miri and Dany.
You knew what I was buying and you knew the price, and yet you let me pay it. It was wrong of them to burn my temple, the heavy, flat-nosed woman said placidly. That angered the great shepherd. This was no god's work, Dany said coldly. If I look back, I am lost. You cheated me. You murdered my child within me. The stallion who mounts the world will burn no cities now. His Khalasar shall trample no nations into dust.
Yeah, so like I brought up last episode, how does she even believe in the stallion who mounts the world? Does she hear that prophecy and say, oh yeah, that's true, that's going to happen, I better kill this baby? I have some doubts about that, but she absolutely claims credit for Rhaego's death, no doubt. Now,
which also doesn't make sense if Rhaego's been dead for years.
Right?
Or tons of holes in her story.
Yeah, it's hard to get. That's why I have so many questions here, why I keep bringing it up, because it's an interesting, enduring mystery. And I think that because the more magic is going to happen later in the story, it does us some good to try to piece what we know together so that when more magic comes later in the series, we have a better ability to interpret it and kind of understand what the story's telling us. Because this notion that Miri did it on purpose is a bit in contrast to the prior notion that Dany thinks Jorah carrying her into the tent did it. So which is true? Let's look at another quote here.
Ser Jorah had killed her son, Dany knew. He had done what he did for love and loyalty, yet he had carried her into a place no living man should go, and fed her baby to the darkness.
The things he did for love. I never really thought of it that way. Even didn't have that in my notes. Just thought of that now. So words are wind, of course. That's an enduring principle. So what Miri says is up for debate versus what she actually meant to do. But the result is clearly magical and final. She points out that, Dany, points out that she felt Rhaego kicking and had before. So despite the fact that he was born dead and had been for years, something definitely changed. And A Dance with Dragons, to be fair as well to the idea that I'm pushing back against a bit, Dany still thinks of Mary Mazdur as having murdered Rhaego. Either way. The magic itself, someone who didn't really speak up much. We have a witness still out there. Jorah himself. Dany was unconscious when Jorah carried her into the tent, but Jorah was clearly conscious. He sees this blood magic in progress and says there were only shadows. Miri tells him those shadows can be powerful, and Dany thinks how the shadows have touched Jorah too. It's an interesting notion given the kind of man he is, although he was already kind of shady. Yeah. But later, in A Dance with Dragons, he does acquire a demon tattoo on his face to mark him as an unruly, dangerous slave, and he starts to look more and more horrific as he's endured beatings and all sorts of other injuries. Well, maybe he didn't literally have these shadows in him, but he is becoming a darker figure. So maybe there is some magic element to Jorah in his own way. I never really thought about it, even though it was pretty straightforward as a mention in this chapter. The chapter ends with Dany putting Drogo out of his misery, a different sort of determination that she's showing. That's a hard thing to do. It reminds me a little bit of the execution of Lady, a little bit. But in this case, there's magical overtones, and, well, there's a lot more. We're wondering things like, for example, was his placement in the pyre important? Was his death part of the price that was paid for the dragon eggs?
His death happened a little bit before the pyre, obviously.
Yeah.
So it makes it harder to see it as a sacrifice.
Totally agree. It's a small flaw in that idea. But, at the same time, all the extra death outside the tent with the Blood Riders and all that, like Miri, I don't think she got a plan for that either. But maybe it just enhanced the magic. Maybe it made it more powerful. Maybe that was part of what let it get out of control. Very mysterious. Very hard to say. Couple random thoughts and questions here from Laura Brandos, the Lady of Infinity. The Lands of Ice and Fire map shows a tree with lemons on it next to the Sea Lord's palace. I think I had forgotten about that. That is a great catch. That's an official map. It's not a fan map. The Lands of Ice and Fire are canon. So a tree with lemons right there is, well, folks, kind of hard to argue with that if it's right there on the map. Brendan B. says, I think the fact she doesn't dream the second time, instead, quote, she floated, serene and at peace, foreshadows her death after the destruction of King's Landing. Interesting point, Brendan. I had not thought of that. On the surface, I got to agree. Maybe needs a little more thought. This is one I'll have to float to our pun intended, to our fellow Q&A next week. Our fellow Q&A next week. I'll float that to Joe and Lady Gwyn next week as well. Of course, I mentioned the bit about Dany's ancestors in this chapter. We're not going to talk about that too much. We do a lot of talking about that in the Great Empire of the Dawn episode, and it's fascinating, really fun. It's a hugely deep dive, one of the deepest dives we do into ancient history, super ancient history, but also psycho ancient history because of all the theorizing and magic and some occasional varying off into tinfoil land we go. But yeah, no need to repeat all that. Nina Friel points out that Dany's feeling of power and lack of fear is mirrored a bit when Bran is getting control of his warg abilities. Here's a quote she pulled us from A Storm of Swords.
Prince of the Green, Prince of the Wolf's Wood. He was strong and swift and fierce, and all that lived in the good green world went in fear of him.
Now, contrast to how there's the same thing when Dany flying over the Dothraki Sea. She mentions the green, and then the last line. Well,
all that lived and breathed fled in terror from the shadow of her wings.
Oh, yeah. I mean, power. Like, we talk about power being a corrupting influence on anybody. Power corrupts, absolutely. Well, the power of controlling a dragon or a direwolf that controls other animals and all that, that is a really hard thing to be disciplined about, right? I mean, it seems like it would be anyway. I don't know from personal experience.
I require discipline to control myself.
She has all this power over here controlling all our sound and controlling. She could ban any of you at any point. She could ban me.
I can barely control you.
How are you not corrupted by all this power?
Oh, I am.
One question we got from multiple people was, did this is a surprising question because I never thought of it before. Did maybe Miri accidentally save Dany by accidentally or intentionally killing Rhaego? Because having that inside you might be deadly, right? But I don't know about that because it's possible. No, I don't think it's possible because we obviously don't need blood magic for these sort of dragon babies to exist, because we've seen that from Maegor, we've seen that from Rhaenyra. So as far as we know, there was no blood magic involved there. Maybe there was, but or maybe it all ties back to the nature of the Targaryens, which may involve blood magic, the making of the Targaryen bloodline. There could be magic from far back that still lingers. In fact, there definitely is, because they're part dragon. I mean, they have actual blood of the dragon. That is now as official as these things can be without, a narrator telling us so. So I can believe it. I can believe that inside her, that dragon baby would have, done awful things. I mean, think of what Rhaenyra yells when she's giving birth to little Visenya. She says, "Monster, monster, get out, get out," and she's in great pain. So.
This is in the next Dany chapter, but it's worth mentioning while we talk about that here, about the blood of the dragon and all that. Dany actually nurses the dragons herself, which I had blocked out because that's really gross. But she does actually nurse them, which speaks even more to that. Yeah,
the idea that they're relatives. They have. Yeah, someone else pointed out that reptiles don't drink milk, but whatever. These are magical reptiles. They can drink whatever they want. They can drink their mother of dragons'
it's fire milk.
Fire milk,
like Osha poured in Lewin's gash.
His gash. How come everything about Lewin is sexual today? That's definitely nothing. We could not have predicted that. All his tubes and his gash. I mean, geez. So Miri repeating what she's, her experience with the sack of her village and her being raped and all that. It's terrible. It's traumatic. It's heart-wrenching. We don't want to read that again. But the point she makes is that life isn't just breathing and your heart beating and existing. It's the same point she makes with Drogo. It's the one that she wants to rub in Dany's face. It's a really interesting concept when you get into it, but Miri has made a mockery of it and revenge out of it. And, well, quote,
"Tell me again what you saved. Your life." Miri Mazdur laughed cruelly. "Look to your call and see what life is worth when all the rest is gone."
Yeah, he's literally just breathing. He is alive in only the most technical sense of the word. Mary.
Yeah, and this is a modern day concern even now is whether you pull the plug on someone or not. What are they? What is life?
You're right. Yeah, and it's even more painful in that sense when there's all this like expense associated with it.
Yeah.
You know? So let's not get.
Imagine Dany trying to keep Drogo alive and taken care of, the amount of work without modern day amenities.
Yeah, and it's interesting, there is a large sacrifice of wealth as part of it. She throws, as we'll see in the next chapter, she throws like all his worldly possessions, including, you know, all these valuable things on his pyre. And, you know, maybe that's kind of metaphorical as well in its own way. At least it works that way. I don't know. I doubt George had that in mind, but it kind of works by accident. So this also gets to at the heart of what Miri's intent was, which is something, well, you know, we're still on the trail of that. Which is to give Dany what Dany gave her. This is the revenge bit that we're talking about. Dany thought she was doing Miri a favor, but made way too much out of it. She's like, you owe me gratitude. Like, gratitude? Are you kidding me? Miri was still set to be a slave who had lost everything she loved. If she's supposed to thank Dany for that, I mean, that's real naive on Dany's part. I mean, Dany's really young. She's supposed to be naive. It's not supposed to work this way for young kids. You're not supposed to be in this situation. But this is the world she lives in. So to Miri, death was probably preferable than that life, though I'm sure she would have preferred to have had a quicker death than burning. But anyway, that's another story. Another not quick death is promised by Dany in this chapter to Mago and Jogo, who we get at the end of A Dance with Dragons, meaning they show up and that story starts to come back full circle. So this chapter, again, ties to that one in so many ways. And it also shows just how vicious she can be when it comes to revenge. Not only is she willing to do this burning of Miri and this ritual, but the death she promises to Mago and Drogo, she says they will die screaming, which, of course, that's also what Miri does.
Miri did. I just want to also say, Miri, it's like the ultimate slap in Miri's face that she thought she was ridding the world of the stallion who mounts the world, and instead she was creating them by engendering this way for Dany to birth dragons.
You're right.
Whether she was necessary for it or not, obviously we can't say, but I think she was pretty important to it.
I think you're totally right. I mean, the idea that people are, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, you know, and that Miri was trying to, you know, this small act of understandable revenge just has this huge, just unbelievable side effect of teaching Dany in a way, giving her the path. Like, as we'll see later in the next chapter, Dany doesn't fully know what she's doing, but she's trying to follow Miri's steps and bumble through this magic as best as she can. George flat out says that. So, yeah, it's really, really just... I kind of doubt we'll ever get an example throughout the rest of the series where misinterpretation of magic or self-fulfilling prophecy goes quite this epically. Even with, you know, Cersei sort of creating her own self-fulfilling prophecy with the Valonqar and other examples like that. It's hard to imagine it rising to the level of, oops, I let dragons into the world again. I was trying to stop the stallion who mounts the world, and I created the mare who mounts the world. Whoopsie. Now, Tyrion's up next, and let's not forget, he also has he can be quite vicious too. And let's not forget, he was rumored to have a tail when he was born, which that's maybe part of the evidence that he was sired by Aerys. Maybe not evidence, but a clue. So let's talk about that amongst lots of other things. Tyrion 9. The gang hears all about the battles of the camps, aka the one where Tywin yells, "They have my son." Quote,
"They have my son," Tywin Lannister said. We really had to say that 3 times in this episode. You know what, Aziz? They have my son. They have my son and my son's son and my son's son's son. Don't ever talk to them again.
And he says later in the chapter, he says it louder while standing up. He stands there, "They have my son."
Exactly. We have to just keep saying
really
it. That was another time that we said, "They have my son."
Of course, that's the main ramification for Tywin. But of course, there's a lot more to it. Much of the chapter is a recap. It's the third way we have to see battle. We have Cat from a close distance and Tyrion in the thick of it. Now we have a messenger and other characters used as narrators explaining it. So let's To start, there's the craven and annoying Sir Harry Swift whining throughout the chapter about how awful this all is. He's the same one who complains about having to go to Bravos to talk to the Iron Bank in the epilogue of Dance with Dragons. So he's still around, this guy. One of the things Harry Swift complains about is Jaime's strategy at River Run. Kevin explains it succinctly here, quote,
Jaime had little choice in the matter. The castle is situated at the end of the point of land where the Tumblestone flows into the red fork of the Trident. The rivers form two sides of a triangle, and when danger threatens, the Tullys open their sluice gates upstream to create a wide moat on the third side, turning River Run into an island. The walls rise sheer from the water, and from their towers the defenders have a commanding view of the opposite shores for many leagues around. To cut off all the approaches, a besieger must needs place one camp north of the Tumblestone, one south of the Red Fork, and a third between the rivers west of the moat. There is no other way, none.
And the messenger explaining the battle itself. I love just recapping this. Well, I love Ashaya recapping this.
Yeah. They came down on the north camp first. No one was expecting an attack. Mark Piper had been raiding our supply trains, but he had no more than 50 men. Sir Jaime had gone out to deal with them the night before. Well, with what we thought was them. We were told the Stark host was east of the Green Fork, marching south. The Blackfish led the van, cutting down our sentries and clearing away the palisades for the main assault. By the time our men knew what was happening, riders were pouring over the ditch banks and galloping through the camp with swords and torches in hand. I was sleeping in the west camp, between the rivers. When we heard the fighting and saw the tents being fired, Lord Brax led us to the rafts and we tried to pull across, but the current pushed us downstream and the Tullys started flinging rocks at us with the catapults on their walls. I saw one raft smash to kindling and 3 others overturned. Men swept into the river and drowned. And those who did make it across found the Starks waiting for them on the riverbanks.
In a way, I could say, or you could say, we could say, this is another broken trope, perhaps. And what I mean is, despite Tyrion being a sympathetic character mostly to this point, maybe less in the long run, but pretty sympathetic to this point, the Lannisters are formidable villains, but even though Swift is over the top about how bad things are, how could it happen? It's a catastrophe. Tyrion cuts the chase by pointing out, yeah, we're losing. And the Starks want revenge thanks to Joffrey. They're not going to accept peace here. They're kicking our butts. So what I mean is that it's odd to see the family cast as the villains, even though we know that, in the long run, the villain and good guy families aren't really what this story's about. But it kind of seems that way at this point. The fact that the villains are losing at the end of the book is unusual. Usually you see kind of the good guys like, oh, we're losing. How are we going to come back? We gotta get ourselves together. We got to be plucky and rise to the occasion and all that. But that's part of the trope that's being broken here. The Lannisters do come back and kind of win this war, in part because Tywin is capable. And, I criticize his strategy against Robb, but he's a lot more effective here. Note I say effective because I'm not going to call him good. His plans are far too ruthless and unethical for me to call them good. But not only does Tywin have resources above and beyond all the other houses, even after losses like this, but he's willing to do things that his enemies aren't. He has more in his arsenal in some ways because he's crueler, more ruthless. But one of the more important factors for him, the most important factor here is, and moves that he makes, is a much more conventional one, and it goes just like this.
Lord Tywin rose abruptly. You are my son! Sorry. That was when he knew. You have given him up for lost, he thought. You bloody bastard. You think Jaime's good as dead, so I'm all you have left. Tyrion wanted to slap him, to spit in his face, to draw his dagger and cut the heart out of him and see if it was made of old, hard gold, the way the small folks said. Yet he sat there, silent and still.
I'm a little confused as why Tyrion thinks this here. I mean, there's missing context because, Tyrion has a whole long, full relationship with his father, and it's not all on display here. But Has he really given Jaime up his loss? It doesn't seem like it. He seems very nervous about Jaime. He seems like it's distressing him, but I don't know that he's given up on him. There's and Tyrion wanted real responsibility, and this is what he's getting. He's giving him the job of being Hand. Tyrion worries that he's being sent to hold the left again, like it's a death sentence. But it's not. I mean, it's dangerous, but they're all in danger. Joffrey and Cersei are at King's Landing, and Tywin doesn't want them to die. He wants them under control. So I think that Tyrion's a little off here.
Yeah, I mean, just the idea that he thinks that King's Landing is a death sentence maybe points to his read not being completely right.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, this is potentially the first time Tyrion has ever seen his father actually trying to groom him for command in some way. So he has to it's a good reason for him to think he's, they have his son.
Yeah, it's so unusual.
Give
He's
him
like,
up for loss.
This is not how my father behaved. Something's up here. Yeah, it's usual. I agree with you.
I think part of it is likely his alarm at Joffrey.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's maybe the more major thing than losing Jaime.
Yeah.
Is Joffrey is such a wild card that Tyrion has some boldness to him that he could stand up to Joffrey.
Yeah, that's a good point. And as well as a clear read on the situation, which is not what Tywin realized Tyrion would have. And that, as Laura Brandos points out in the chat here, Tyrion's cup analogy is really good, really well written and really perfect, and is part of what Tywin takes note of. He's like, well said. Actually, you've grasped this situation and everyone's takes pretty perfectly. Now, of course, just like Robb and Ned are, like Robb being like his father is a recurring powerful theme. It's the same with Tyrion here, even though there's some doubts over the siring of Tyrion. There's no doubt that Tywin is his father, right? He raised him. The impact is huge. So to me, that's a thing with the old Aerys theory, is that it doesn't change who raised Tyrion, and he's going to be like Tywin because Tywin raised him. He could have been, a pot boy from Lys.
Pot boy?
Yeah, pot boy.
Oh, you're a pot boy.
It doesn't matter whether he's Tywin's blood or not if he was raised by Tywin. It's the same concept as being adopted. Same as Ned and Jon. So, pride. That's one of the main influences that Tywin has imparted on Tyrion, whether purposefully or not. And it's central to this chapter, just as it is central to Tyrion's arc and Tywin's arc, Lions and pride. Of course, those things go together. Tywin gets angry talking about Janos Slynt being promoted to Lord. There's all these things for him to be mad about, but that one really gets him. Compared to the other things, I think that's minor, but Tywin is so mad about Janos Slynt being promoted to Lord. He also mentions Barristan and how stupid it was to send him off. And remember, I pointed out that Barristan was told in open court that Tywin had offered him a keep to retire in. But in this chapter, we see Tywin had no idea that they were going to dismiss Barristan. So they were lying and for some reason, or they just expected Tywin would go along with it. I'm not quite sure about that. Then, of course, to remind us how terrible he is, Tywin adds the kicker about you have to leave Shay behind. Well, that's not how he says it, but, it adds to the moment of Tywin hating. But also this is self-hate for Tyrion because, he hates his father in a lot of ways, but he's like him. So it would make sense that he would hate himself a bit. Of course, he also hates how everybody looks at him and all that. So there's a lot going on here. He's also, just like Ashaya pointed out, he's not used to or comfortable with his father showing confidence in him. It's just unusual, and he's suspicious of it in a sense. That's why he worries about being sent to guard the left again. And he jokes. He always jokes. It's a defense mechanism for Tyrion. And this joke about Rhaegar, though, being alive, it's a weird joke. It's intentionally awkward, I think. The timing of it, and it's not a good joke. It's just weird. So I think it's a clever writing on George's part that Tyrion is just off-put by the situation, and he's just using humor as, like I said, as a defense mechanism.
Poorly,
yeah. Poorly, yes. People, and that's a real thing, right? People try to make bad jokes when they're nervous. Like you meet someone that you like for the first time, and you make a really awkward joke, or you're someone who makes you nervous. Obviously, it's not a problem of liking Tywin here, but Yeah, that seems very human to make awkward attempts at humor when you don't feel comfortable. So like a lot of the other final chapters for each POV, and this is, of course, Tyrion's final chapter here, there's a lot of setup. If we take what we saw in Sansa's chapter, we get a full look at the Lannister family at the end of the book. Joffrey's gotten worse, revealing himself to be dangerous, but in a chaotic way, and even Tywin suggests Joffrey could ruin us all, he says. Tywin himself, though, very capable, though, maybe not quite as badass and smart as a lot of the fandoms made him out to be. I think he's a little bit overrated, but he's far more dangerous than Joffrey, that's no doubt, excepting those who are like in Joff's personal space, perhaps. Neither Cersei nor Jaime appear terribly clever at this point, but we know that that's partly because we haven't had them very fleshed out yet. And they're both clearly dangerous in their own ways, although not at the moment for Jaime since he's been captured. Over time, as we know, whether you end up liking him or not, it's fair to say Jaime becomes far more sympathetic and is fleshed out as a character quite a bit. This sort of applies to Cersei as well, and there are some more Lannisters that we haven't gotten from much yet, and others who haven't been on screen yet. But to this point, again, Tyrion's really the only sympathetic Lannister. So that's really interesting to me, how things have set up versus how it changes over time. The chapter ends with him defying his father, telling Shae he intends to take her to King's Landing with him. And he happens to be sleeping in a bell tower, by the way, a bell tower. And Tree Girl points out this is the same room Catelyn had when she stayed there. But before he gets to his bell tower, maybe a sign of whose side he'll take, he sees the dangling body of Masha Heddle, owner of the inn where Tyrion was taken captive by Catelyn. He compares Masha Heddle's ragged flesh to the way Lannister hopes are standing at that point. So again, this is unusual to see Lannisters doing so poorly, the villainous family doing so poorly at this peak time so early. It's they who make the comeback, not the Starks. Maybe I spoke too soon. The Starks will probably make a comeback much later, but we're not to that point yet. Certainly not in our reread, certainly not in the books at all. So one could say that the fact that Tywin chose to hang Masha Heddle is peak Tywin. She had nothing to do with Tyrion being taken. In fact, she tried to stop it, as we saw, but she was entirely powerless to do so. And that's the point. She's completely powerless. Just as she's powerless when Tywin's men come to execute her for circumstance, coincidence. It's galling even more when you realize that Tywin is smart enough to realize this too. He knows that she had no power in that situation. She knows that she probably had nothing to do with any of it. But he sees it as either a need or an opportunity or both to exercise Lannister power to send a message. He's like, well, I don't care about this person's life, but I can hang her and send a message, and that's important. It's just, he doesn't enjoy it. I don't think he gets a rise out of it, not that we know of, but he thinks it's important. And he's totally willing to do it without any apparent thought for her. And because it's obvious to him, it'll be obvious to others. The message, that is, the execution of a woman, it says, hey, don't mess with the Lannisters. Don't even look like you messed with the Lannisters. That is quite a direct message. It's hard to miss the point, and the point is unfair and unjust, but nothing you can do about it. You're powerless in the face of Casterly Rock and Tywin Lannister. A few random thoughts and questions here. Tywin's declaration of Tyrion being his son is sometimes held up as evidence against Tyrion Targaryen as a theory, which is a fair point. But of course, Tywin later says the exact opposite, that he's not his son and that he can't prove otherwise. So I don't know that any of this is clarity. Sir Adam, interesting thing here. He derides the suggestion that Robb Stark would trade Jaime for his sisters. He says that he would be an utter ass to do so. Yet Robb laments not doing that because he thinks that, hey, I should have traded Jaime for Sansa and Arya and then married Sansa to Robert Arryn and brought the Vale into the war. That's basically what it is. Yeah, it is. You're right. It is basically trading. That's true. I used the wrong word, but it's actually the right word. Mm-hmm. Trading Sansa for an army. Though, in this what-if scenario, there's no guarantee Lysa would have consented. She still might have been like, nope, we're staying, we're locking the door to the Vale, and there's no marriage, there's none of that. So, it's no sure thing, but it's interesting that Adam thinks this is a ridiculous idea, and actually it's not.
It's funny that he doesn't even consider the idea of marrying Sansa to, say, Quentin Martell. Like, Dorne had, like, they even have an eligible heir, or not
That's
heir,
true.
but an eligible son that could marry and that they could get more. I mean, it's not like it takes a while for Dorne to get out in the field, or they aren't as good as I don't know.
That's a good
Anyways, he
point.
doesn't even
Yeah.
think about it.
Yeah, they don't really think about Dorne, maybe because it's too far away.
Yeah,
It's
and
just-
they have a familial connection to the Vale already. But
Yeah.
if that had gone south, you might say,
Heyo.
they might have gone south. Yeah.
So another oddity from this chapter is Gregor's talking about eyes and cut their eyes out if they see nothing. Like, it's just weird. It's just a weird thing for him to say. It's just showing how brutal he is. And Tywin looks at him, and Tyrion can't tell whether it's approval or disgust. And, well, that by itself says something. Like, you can't tell Tywin's approval from his disgust. But in general, even though he's emotionless most of the time, this is the chapter where we probably see the most emotion from him. His yelling about his son, the thin sheen of sweat on his forehead, and maybe reacting to Gregor here. Things like that. It's usually he's just kind of stone-faced or ice-faced or lion-faced. I don't know. Gold-faced.
I think the idea of him not being able to tell his approval or disgust, just wanted to make a joke here that that Tywin just wants to feel better than everyone and feel disgusted by everyone. So when someone does so, he also feels approval and happiness to feel holier than thou.
Nina points out some irony to Tyrion's bad Rhaegar joke, which is that, sure, yeah, Rhaegar is dead, but his son is alive, and of course his fake son, probably fake, but either way, people think he's his son. It might be his real son, and perhaps even more importantly, his sister with her dragon. So, yeah, maybe it's not such good news after all. Jon IX, the one where Jon runs off, aka the gang rescues Jon from dumminess, aka Jon rescues him from himself. He even starts to realize he's being dumb, but he can't help himself. He does things without fully regarding the consequences, but there's zero questioning his bravery. I think if we're being fair, that's a theme the show captured pretty well, though they focused on it too much. There's a lot more to Jon than this. Quote,
"The mare whickered softly as Jon Snow tightened the cinch."
He knows he'll be an outlaw. He even starts to realize Robb won't be happy to see him, but he keeps going anyway. A lot of the chapter is the ride and his friends trying to stop him and catching up with him, and I don't have a whole lot to say about that. It speaks for itself, with a few exceptions. He rides past Molestown and thinks of how common oath-breaking there is. It's a minor moral conundrum, a harbinger for much larger conundrums regarding oaths and vows and duty versus love. And, well, it's an irony for him thinking of men breaking their oaths with the sex workers in Molestown. He's going to break his vows with Ygritte in the near future, and, well, he will feel guilty about it, but maybe he shouldn't. There's something to be said symbolically, too, for Ghost following Jon and been following behind, but eventually catching up and giving up his presence to his friends. I think it's kind of funny that Ghost, who makes no sound, is key in revealing Jon's presence. It's like he can't escape his heritage. His real heritage is always going to catch up with him. That Stark side is always going to catch up to him. The Targaryen heritage is important, but this may win out in the end. But just as he falls for Ygritte, if we're thinking about that, Ghost may not be representing his Stark side. It may be representing his eventual life north of the Wall, the old god side, the wildlings living in that. That's where Ghost comes from. Ghost isn't necessarily a representative of his Stark heritage in this case, or even in general. He may more be pointing more towards that, his ending north of the Wall and being part of the wildling culture. Speaking of the Targ heritage, there's the idea that he has a different name. In other words, that his name isn't actually Jon. And there's a little clever, perhaps, nod to that idea. You may even call it powerful evidence that of his possible alternate names, the popular two are, of course, Aemon and Aegon. There's other theories, but I'm definitely thinking it's Aemon or Aegon.
It's Visenya.
It's Visenya.
I'll die on this hill.
It's Visenyo.
Visenyo.
It's Visenyo. Now, so here's some reverse psychology towards, quote.
Nor was he Aemon Targaryen.
Or was he? Nor was he, or was he? The guy we know is called Aemon for sure. Maester Aemon is knew that Jon was likely to run, and Mormont had Jon watched. So Jon later finds out it wasn't just his friends that made the difference in finding him. He wasn't getting away. Everyone was watching. Jon thought he was so sneaky, but basically half the castle was watching him leave. A funny nod of a quote comes here.
Unless you have a horse with wings like a raven, do you? No. Jon felt like a fool. Pity. We could use a horse like that.
Yeah, Mormont's kind of funny.
It just reminds me of it's both Bitter Steel and Blood Raven right there together.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, right. All this Targaryen bastard talk. It fits Jon really well. Oh, and is it a kind of a dragon riding thing too, or is it a Bran thing as well? It certainly seems to be the Targ bastard thing, but. Blood Raven, I don't know. There's some hidden symbolism there. Anyway, before he can be a Stark or Targaryen or both, he's neither, not because he's ignorant of his true birth circumstances, though that is part of it, but because he's joined the Night's Watch. They forsake their former houses. Jon doesn't know what he's given up. Something Benjen points out back in his first chapter, but for different reasons. But still, it's true. He doesn't know what he's given up. But as we see from the show, as people figured out before the show was a possibility, and just only to see it seemingly come true, Jon has a technicality available to him, perhaps, that his friends happen to point out accidentally. Quote,
"Now my watch begins. You said it. It shall not end until my death. I shall live and die at my post," Gren added, nodding.
Yeah. The death is the key there, isn't it?
He did die at his post.
He sure did. And though he may become something outside of the Watch, the work of the Black Brothers is clearly a key here. Mormont points out a number of ominous signs, a great way to give this chapter some punch and excitement to set up Jon's next set of chapters in Clash. Quote,
"The cold winds are rising, Snow. Beyond the wall, the shadows lengthen. Cotter Pike writes of vast herds of elk streaming south and east towards the sea, and mammoths as well. He says one of his men discovered huge, misshapen footprints not 3 leagues from Eastwatch. Rangers from the Shadow Tower have found whole villages abandoned, and at night, Ser Dany says they see fires in the mountains, huge blazes that burn from dusk till dawn."
As we know, Jon deals with all those things. He goes beyond the wall, sees giants and wildlings, and hears of the dead, and becomes a skin changer, and deals with another skin changer. And Mormont says it doesn't matter who sits the Iron Throne when the dead come walking, and he's got a point, though I think it does matter. They need help, and if, say, Jon Snow were king in the North, well, he wouldn't let the Watch be so undermanned like Joff certainly will.
I mean, in the show, it didn't matter who was on the Iron Throne when they defeated everyone.
I guess you're right.
Not to go against your point, but
you're right in a sense. I think it could have helped.
Yeah, it would have 100% helped.
Yeah.
I don't think there's no could have helped. It would have helped.
Yeah.
But
well, maybe you won't say it didn't matter. It wasn't. They were able to overcome not having the support of the Iron Throne.
Yeah, they were able to overcome. I think that's a better way to put it.
So it's a nitpick, perhaps, but the bottom line, he's right. His point is still true. If I'm just nitpicking, the bottom line is that the war against the dead should be more important than the war for the Iron Throne. That's what he's trying to say. And things like revenge and family don't matter as much or at all when the stakes are this high. And Jon is appropriately chagrined by this illumination that Gior is completely right. A couple random thoughts about this chapter. We'll start off with a quote here that we think is important.
Tyrion Lannister, that's right, yeah. Tyrion Lannister had claimed that most men would rather deny a hard truth than face it, but Jon was done with denials. He was who he was. Jon Snow, bastard and oathbreaker, motherless, friendless, and damned. For the rest of his life, however long that might be, he would be condemned to be an outsider, the silent man, standing in the shadows, who dares not speak his true name. Wherever he might go throughout the 7 kingdoms, he would need to live a lie, lest every man's hand be raised against him. Whew. I couldn't help but feel a little whiny there.
A little bit, and so wrong.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
but
bastard, oathbreaker.
So right at the same time.
Yeah,
he truly is the man who dares not speak his true name, and he will be at some point.
That's really
He
true.
will need to live a lie.
Yeah.
But it's instead of every man's hand raised against him, it could be every man's hand raised for him.
Yeah. And he's not done with denials. He's in denial here in that this will go well for him. He's wrong that he's a bastard, probably. Maybe he's right that he's an oathbreaker. He's not motherless, even though he doesn't know who his mother is. Friendless, certainly not friendless. His friends save him. They come to get him. They try to stop him. His friends are everywhere, although over time he loses a lot of them. And of course, the quote, for the rest of his life, however long that might be, well, about 4 books. And but condemned to be an outsider. Yeah, that sounds right. Condemned to be if he goes and ends up living north of the wall when it's all said and done. Silent man standing in the shadows. Yeah. That's some serious foreshadowing for Jon.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a little, something a little more lighter.
Yeah. Are you such a mighty warrior, or do you carry a grumpkin in your pocket to magic up your sword? Is that a grumpkin in your pocket or a magic sword? But no,
it's a mirrorish tube.
But no, the idea of a magic sword obviously can't help but intrigue anyone, especially he already has a magic sword, because he has Longclaw, but we have heard of more magical swords.
Yeah, we wonder, is he going to claim one of the others? Is he going to get Blackfire, or is he going to keep Longclaw, or is he going to something else? Is he going to wield Dawn or something like that? There's lots of other ways for it to go.
Or is it him on a dragon is, again, the idea of that. The magic sword being that you're, a dragon.
That's a good call here. And from Archmaester Rennie on Flick, he points out the quote, take his place by his brother's side and help avenge his father. If you look at that in a different way, does that mean he will join Fagon? I never thought of it that way. It's interesting. It's possible. I mean, in the show, he has these reservations about Dany, even though he loves her, and there's no Fagon. So having Fagon in the mix, having young Griff in the mix, yeah, if Jon thinks that if he finds out that he's part Targaryen and thinks that Rhaegar is... that this is really Rhaegar's son, then hey, he'll look at that guy and be like, that's my brother. And he will maybe still not know that Bran and Rickon are alive when that happens. He probably will. That'll probably have been revealed by then. But he's lost Robb, and it would be quite a thing to have that and to avenge his father, avenge Rhaegar against what was done to him. So yeah, that's a really good way to look at that phrase in a different light, and it could come true. Never thought about that. Definitely involves more thought. Shout out to Thomas Pappas for his wonderful stick figure rendition of Molestown in the Facebook group. And there was much rejoicing. It got a lot of laughs, including from me. Fun things happen in the Facebook group discussion of these chapters. Here's a quote from a bit before. This is more a reference to Tywin.
Yeah, Brian E. says... On Roose Bolton's face, rage and joy looked much the same. That's from a Theon chapter. And he continues with, those two, Tywin and Roose, have some other similarities, so their shared poker faces are very interesting.
That's a good point. Yeah, they definitely do. They're, completely... I mentioned that Tywin is willing to do things that others aren't. That gives him a power, in a sense. Roose is in that same category. There's nothing Roose won't do. There's nothing he won't. There's nothing to be like, oh, it would be wrong to do that, so I won't do it. That slows down people like Robb and Ned, but Tywin and Roose are like, eh.
I think Tywin takes more pleasure in hurting people.
He might.
I don't know about that 100%, but I think he does. Maybe he has more things he feels are slights against him, though.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that. I think Roose is not as proud as Tywin.
Yeah, and so when you're proud like that, you take more pleasure, perhaps, in showing...
Exercising.
Yeah.
Being powerful, yeah, in exercising the power over people who are weaker. That's an interesting point of view. I think that makes some sense. Yeah, Roose maybe doesn't... yeah, they're similar but different. I like that. It's a very good comparison. Catelyn XI. The gang gets loud about some king, a.k.a. the one where Robb gets promoted. Though he's been mentioned a lot to this point, and we know him well from prior reads in the show, it's also the one where we meet Edmure for the first time. Hoster Tully as well, though he's weak and dying, and soon incapable of conversation. Though, of course, he still says a few things. So here we see the beginning of his end. He's still complaining about Blackfish never marrying, which seems almost endearing, until we realize he doesn't really know what day it is, meaning I don't mean like day of the week. He's got maybe a little bit of dementia or failing memory. He's lost what even decade it is. So it's for that and many other reasons, it's a chilling and powerful chapter. Still gets me after all these years, the way they acclaim Robb at the end. There was a thread in our Facebook group about how this moment still gets people. The King in the North moment, it's still chilling after so many rereads. And that's just because the writing is so good. It's still tragic. It's still powerful. It hit hard before it seemed tragic. I didn't know Robb was going to die when I first read this book, but it hit me hard then. And now that I do know he's going to die, same. Well, not same, but similar. Quote.
It seemed 1,000 years ago that Catelyn Stark had carried her infant son out of River Run, crossing the Tumblestone in a small boat to begin their journey north to Winterfell.
Part of what makes it good is all the sadness. No one is coming out of this with a fully happy ending, especially the ones who were brutally murdered only to come back as the living dead, like she is. The frequent theme of Robb being like Ned comes up again and again and again. Quote,
Lord Robb went to visit the Godswood, my lady. It was what Ned would have done. He is his father's son as much as mine, I must remember.
And again, here, when debating which of the Southern Kings they should follow.
The right, said Robb stubbornly. Catelyn thought he sounded eerily like his father as he said it.
During Robb and Kat's grieving scene together, we get a look at the River Run heart tree, too. This is cool.
Can I also say Catelyn should have thought he sounded eerily like a Shea when he said it. But here's the River Run heart tree. Surrounded by tall redwoods and great old elms, a slender weirwood with a face more sad than fierce.
It's an interesting way to write it, more sad than fierce, but like as if fierce would be what it's expected to be, but it's also sad, more sad. So it's an interesting way to write that. So Catelyn finds her son, Robb, and the Northern Lords, plus Tytos Blackwood, i.e. the ones who keep the old gods. They're all praying at this tree. She doesn't want to disturb them, so she waits, and while waiting, she remembers, which is a poignant way to frame the scene, remembering. After all, weirwoods remember, the North remembers, so Cat having this remembering moment is very fitting. In what could be considered a form of remembering, as in remembering how well war tends to go in the long run, meaning that peace is better, to quote the Green Grace, the pearl beyond price is what she calls peace. Catelyn's speech about peace and revenge is just an incredible one. It's a favorite from the whole series. Even though it's kind of a hopeless speech because, these men are out for blood and revenge and they have ambitions and goals. So it's part of all this is what makes her turn to this makes her turn to Lady Stoneheart more heartbreaking because she starts off as this peace advocate, then becomes more revenge-minded than even the men in this scene who have a lot of blood on their minds. And there's also irony here, too, because it's Sir Stevron Frey, of all people, who suggests that they hold back. Just wait. Let the South fight it out, and then just see what happens. Just, hey, we've already won some victories, and we have Jaime as a hostage. We can sit back and wait. So Cat and the Frey heir were in agreement. They almost had, I would say they almost had this accord, but they didn't really almost had this accord. Catelyn feels like she almost got them to agree, but if we're being honest, they never would have. Even Robb is like, no way. I mean, they killed my father. Rickard Karstark and Greatjon, even Blackfish are like, nah. And so it begins. Though that's 2 books from now, the notion of what drives Lady Stoneheart to her vicious vengeance and bloody revenge and all that, it could be said to begin here as well. This quote from Edmure is interesting.
When we heard about Lord Eddard, the Lannisters will pay, I swear it. You will have your vengeance.
I like the way that's phrased. You will have your vengeance. Yeah. As the leader of the Brotherhood Without Banners, now in possession of Jaime Lannister, it's like she still has Jaime. She gets him back. And perhaps she has Blackfish as well, on her side, in her squad. So we could see that vengeance coming. We could see it being vicious. We could see Red Wedding 2.0. We could see major setbacks for the Lannisters, the Freys as well. All that. Robb's crown, granted in this chapter and lost 2 books later, it can still be worn by another. That's really important. The Kingdom of the North is shattered and forgotten for a time, but there's some reason to think it will come back. Lots of reasons, really. The talk of crowns begins with the same news we see in Tyrion's chapter, which is that Renly has been crowned. And it leads to debate over which Southern King is the right one, and quickly to the natural idea that it should be neither.
It wasn't structured debate, though.
It wasn't structured debate. it was debarguing. And just like that, a new kingdom is created. As Catelyn thinks, it includes, quote, houses who had never been ruled from Winterfell. King in the North, indeed. King in the North, not King of the North, because it's not just a northern kingdom. And that's crucial because if it was just a northern kingdom, well, the North has so many great natural defenses. But this is a kingdom that seeks to include the Riverlands, the least defensible kingdom. So that's part of what makes it tragic. Part of what's maybe hard to spot at the beginning is that tactical analysis there, how the North is really easy to hold, well, unless you let the Ironborn sneak in behind you and all that. But they could never have done that to the, with the Riverlands is a totally different story. There's just the borders aren't as good. You got these rivers and all that, but there's the Vale is on their border. So is the West. So is the Reach. So is even the Crown Lands. They're just in the middle, and it's hard to hold the middle. Anyway, some more random questions about this. One of the men helping the boat to shore gets a sheepish look when frightened by Grey Wind, which I think is a little wordplay from George, a sheep frightened by a wolf, etc., that kind of thing. John Hagee makes a great observation here. He says there's some more imagery of threes here. Catelyn describes the triangular shape of River Run and the keep inside. 3 rivers are the trident. Hoster has 3 children. Tywin's forces were split 3 ways to surround River Run. Well, Jaime's, I suppose. Same difference. That's cool. I'm also being enjoyed. I'm enjoying being reminded of some of the appearance of less major characters whose actors have replaced, the way they look. Like in the case of Edmure, he doesn't look like Tobias Menzies at all. He looks like this.
Sometimes, you forget, and then you read, Ser Edmure Tully was a stocky young man with a shaggy head of auburn hair and a fiery beard.
It's really similar to Robb.
Yeah,
the way they changed Robb. Like Richard Madden, obviously, was a totally cromulent Robb. I have no complaints really, but he doesn't look like Book Robb at all.
No, and in fact, he looks more like Edmure Tully is described here. They're both stocky with auburn hair, So you see the Tully look represented in Edmure as well. Yeah,
right. It's really interesting. Like Bran looks like this too. I mean, doesn't have a beard.
He's not stocky.
He's not stocky, but he has that coloring.
Yeah.
The red hair and presumably the blue eyes as well. I believe Edmure has blue eyes like the Tullys tend to. Mm-hmm. Nina has an interesting thought here. Points out that Kat remembers Littlefinger chewing mint among the different memories she's having and wonders if he does it now. Nina wonders if he's doing it now because it makes him remember these fond memories of his childhood.
Or he needs to cover his toxic mouth spewing poison.
His foul Littlefinger breath.
Yeah.
As I pointed out last chapter, Theon is bragging while everyone else is mourning. You got Hoster dying and Robb thinking about it, and everyone like grieving over Ned's death. Meanwhile, Theon's off. Let me tell you how the battle went. Blah, blah, blah. So here's another quote that... something we made a bit out of back in the day. Check this out.
Why shouldn't we rule ourselves again? It was the dragons we married, and the dragons are all dead.
Yeah, that line was suspicious back in the day. Before the Targaryen family tree was revealed, before we knew who Aenys and Maegor had married and all that, we didn't know about the Black Brides, and we didn't know that Aenys married a Valyrian. We thought maybe this meant that as part of the Seven Kingdoms conquest by Aegon, maybe Aenys had married a Stark because of this line. It was the dragons we married. Maybe George had that as a possibility in mind, as a way to have a prior ice and fire type character to build off of, to have some history on. Instead, he gave that to Bloodraven, I suppose, to have an ice and fire type figure, to have North and South, to have Targaryen and Old Gods mixed in one figure.
And it's not unusual to use the term married when you're talking about, being married to something, to an idea, to a concept.
Which is what it turned out to be.
Yeah,
but
you
can see why.
But for clarity, that's a turn of phrase for sure.
Yeah, so that's a little meta history for y'all. Here's a... let's actually know. I've got a question here, but we're going to save that for the full Q&A next week. So never mind. Forget I said that.
Ooh, it's like nothing at all.
And here we go. Our last chapter of A Game of Thrones. Daenerys 10. The one where, whoa, holy crap, dragons. AKA The gang hatches some eggs, but does not make any omelets.
I think it's more Dany hatches some eggs.
Yeah, Mary helped. She
Okay,
taught, you know. And other people gave their lives for it. Other people set up the pyre. She didn't build the pyre herself.
Dany kills the gang to hatch some eggs.
Jorah tries to stop her and save her while also propositioning her. That's just Jorah in a nutshell for you. This chapter is so overwhelmingly powerful and dark and legendary. And because it comes on the heels of the King in the North chapter, which leaves you just feeling, whoa, you're already kind of emotionally raw or just feeling it, to use a turn of phrase, vernacular. So having this chapter come right after, you're already kind of maybe vulnerable is the right way to put it. So if you're reading in the normal order, you got major feels from that one, and then this just drops on top of you. It's and it begins with quite a contrast to the lush riverlands and all the green metaphors and imagery from before. Instead, we get this.
The land was red and dead and parched, and good wood was hard to come by. I'm sorry.
Good wood.
I want to be so serious.
It just keeps happening. What is going on, George? We're going to talk about Bone Town some more.
Yeah, I'm sorry to anyone with kids listening to this.
Well, they won't know what you're laughing at.
Maybe now they will after I made that line.
Anyway, it's no wonder that this is quite a contrast. Like red and dead and parched that's hostile to trees. It's no wonder good wood is hard to come by, but it's quite welcoming to fire, which obviously is a big part of this scene. So, though we've figured it out already, that is that she's the stallion or mare who mounts the world, not Rhaego. This is the moment where she actually proves it. George R. R. Martin describes the birth of the dragons as unique, as a miracle. That's the word he uses, a miracle. And he actually uses the word unique as well. So what drives Dany to do all this? It's been building for several chapters since she starts having dreams and, thinking about the eggs and checking out the heat and wondering if there's movement in them and feeling different. Other people don't get the same sensations from them. So it's a combination of all that, plus her dreams, her determination, her will to live, too, because she's in a very tight spot at this point. George R. Martin also says this, quote,
"She makes the magic up as she goes along. She is someone who really might do anything."
Yeah, and part of that is this lack of fear, which I'm going to talk about a little more in a few minutes here. But first, there's some divine providence here as well, I think. After the ceremony, we can call it whatever you want to call the ritual, the magic, the miracle, the Dothraki fall to their knees and swear to do what they just said they wouldn't do. Their culture demands that they return her to the Dosh Khaleen, but what they've witnessed with their own eyes just blows all that away, burns all that away. One part about their culture that does line up here that kind of maybe explains how this works is they're not her blood riders until after the ceremony when they swear to be. But she offers them that, and they're like, no, we can't do that. That's not how our culture works. You can't be blood rider to a woman. And one of them points out, hey, the strong have the right to take from the weak. That's why we're all sitting here with nothing, and why there's these new Khalasars that rode off and took most of the stuff. Well, if you only follow strength, what's stronger than this? Dany is an incredibly powerful leader. What a badass that she stood and faced the flames with total conviction. And it might seem mad, but it worked, and it's strong, even if it's a little crazy or a lot crazy. And set all that aside, the dragons themselves, what is stronger than that? Well, pretty much nothing. Well, eventually. When they're little baby dragons, they're not that strong. But we can all see what's coming. Now, before the flames on the pyre are even lit, the Dothraki begin to show doubts because this happens. Quote,
"Drogo spied it first. There," he said in a hushed voice. Dany looked and saw it, low in the east. The first star was a comet, burning red, blood red, fire red, the dragon's tail. She could not have asked for a stronger sign.
Yeah, I just want to say that it's a little confusing to have Jogo and Joko. There's Khal Joko, and she still has her blood rider Jogo.
I thought he was Jacko.
It could be Jacko,
I think
but
I think it's Jhaqo.
Yeah, is it Joko? I thought it was with an O. Again, you're right. Maybe it's Jacko. Yeah, that would be a better way to do it. Better way to pronounce it.
No, it is Joko. You're right.
Okay.
You're right.
Darn. Yeah, see,
Damn.
That's just confusing.
Yeah.
But anyway, the characters themselves aren't too confusing. It's definitely, if they had used both those characters in the show, they would have changed them. Like they did Osha and Asha.
Man, if they had those in that spelling bee, that would be difficult. It'd be all up to the moderators being very clear.
Yeah.
Jocko and Joko.
So Dany lights the pyre, the flames spread, and, quote, the heat beat at the air with great red wings. Okay, well, there's some symbolism. Everyone backs up as the flames grow, except her. She can handle the heat, more heat. Well, that's putting it mildly, at least, especially in this scene. From here, if you want to make an argument that this is madness of some kind, that a complete lack of fear is peaking here, because she's not just disregarding warnings and the nature of death. She's disregarding how fire works. There's confidence, and there's thinking you're above the laws of nature. This is something beyond confidence, in my opinion. And it's more than that. It's not just confidence in surviving fire. It's confidence in her destiny, which has been poking at her in her dreams and driving her for several chapters now. And it does run in the family, too. We find out that her father thought wildfire would turn him into a dragon. Lots of their ancestors burned themselves or made fools of themselves in less tragic ways, trying to do what she does here. Unlike them, however, what's neat is, and referring to George's quote about how Dany's kind of making it up as she goes along, Rhaegar, Aerys 1 and 2, Egg, Aerion Brightflame, even him. They all had, like, books and scrolls and people like Maester Aemon and Bloodraven to give them at least some advice, at least people to talk to about all this stuff. Dany's entirely isolated from all that. She didn't have any of the evidence, any of the books, any of that stuff. She just has magic and fate and destiny and all that. So from her point of view, from her sandals that burned right off, like all that, all the evidence, it's fate. This looks like she is this being that's guided by destiny. She doesn't know about this other stuff. So whether it's divine providence or the nature of her family or some combination of that and other things, Dany is just more competent than Aerys and even Rhaegar and these other characters. She's more talented. She's just smarter, probably, and far more than her father, and for sure. But some of the others, maybe some of her brothers and other characters, are pretty competent too, but not at her level. I mean, the one that she's most like is Aegon the Conqueror, and even he didn't do anything like what she does here. He inherited his dragons. She made new dragons. Yeah, she had a little help, but Aegon had help too. He had his sisters riding dragons. And before her dragons even grow, she amasses a huge, diverse army, wealth, and following far, far greater than what Aegon the Conqueror amassed. There's a strong case, perhaps it's just open and shut case, that what she's doing is far more impressive than Aegon. So while we sit here and talk about, oh, damn, she's a tragic figure, well, yeah, so what? You know, I mean, maybe it bothers you how the show ended her, and I wouldn't argue against you not feeling the way you want to feel, but I get the sense from some portions of the fandom that it's not okay to love Dany anymore because of all this, and I don't get that. I think that's going way too far. She doesn't have to be some sort of moral paragon. She doesn't have to be a happy ending, or she doesn't have to have a happy ending to be an amazing character. Nothing takes away from the fact that she's a badass, that she overcame so much. Nothing changes the fact that she's fun as a character, even though she's tragic. It's a fantastic ride, her arc, and it's not over yet, because we have unexpected twists and turns yet to come, because the show left so much out. I mean, how many times have I pointed out that Victarion is one of my favorite characters? I obviously don't like Victarion in that sense, so why do we have to feel that way about Dany? Like, I like Varys a lot. Varys is awful. He cuts the tongues out of kids, but he's a fantastic character who I want to know more about. So, yeah, maybe Dany isn't the ultimate good guy, but she's an amazing, fun character, and yeah, I just don't think there's any need for people to feel bad about loving Dany. You shouldn't. She's amazing. She's fun. So there, yeah, my mini rant there. Now, setting aside the state of mind required to think that you're marrying fire, which is how she thinks of it. She thinks like this is a wedding too. It's kind of crazy also. But there's also the confidence that she gets from doing this crazy thing and having it work. Not just having it work, but getting this amazingly perfect result. I mean, we're not supposed to be results oriented in our thinking in life too much, but in this case, how could she not be? I mean, this is the result of, like I keep calling it, divine providence or something. It's a miracle. She performed a miracle. So, but her utter certainty comes before the ceremony. I mean, she's got all this confidence before she does this incredible thing. Quote, look at this one.
"Bring my eggs," Dany commanded her handmaids. Something in her voice made them run.
Yeah, she's already just super confident. She knows this is going to work. She knows it's all good. Her husband's Khalasar is gone. Her blood riders are not her blood riders yet. They're just refusing to do what she wants. They're saying, "Oh, we'll take you to face Dothrak," yet doesn't slow her down. She has very little going for her at this point. No army, but also no fear. Not even a tiny bit of doubt. She has a dragon's confidence before the dragons are born. Now, like I said, there's other interpretations. You know, some of this it may be wrong to call this confidence if you want to say it's madness. Well, that's pretty much what Mirri Maz Duur thinks. Quote,
"As she climbed down off the pyre, she noticed Mirri Maz Duur watching her. 'You are mad,' the god's wife said hoarsely."
From Melisandre to Memories of Aerys and Jaime's point of view, we're going to get, or at least remember, a lot more burnings of people and things as well. But mostly people. That's the part that's shocking and powerful. This is just the first of many, I suppose you could say. It's a good example of something I can't wait to see. George R. R. Martin's description of Dany riding into battle. That's something I can't wait for. You know, I'm not looking forward to more descriptions of burnings, to be clear, if I was unclear the way I said that. It came out wrong. But we've gotten tastes from the end of Dance when Drogon comes down on that horse, and from Fire and Blood, we see what dragons are like in battle. But we haven't seen it from a POV perspective. That's the first real taste of it we've gotten, and it's just a horse. Consider all this power she feels in her previous chapter, like the comparison to the direwolf, and when she feels as if she's an actual dragon herself, with everyone being in fear of her. Remember all that? When we get to the point when she's actually flying Drogon into battle, when he's grown, and when she sweeps down on her enemies with gouts of flame far greater than the ones in this chapter, how much more powerful will she feel? How much more will that affect her? How much more will that touch her state of mind and guide her? How much will that be part of her turn to darkness, to going too far with her sense of justice and all that, however it manifests? And it will manifest. She's going to continue to have this sense of I'm just
of manifest destiny.
Manifest destiny,
which is actually what she is talking about. Essentially,
you're right. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
She because as we said, like at the beginning of her arc, she's being told that this is justice, that getting back the throne is justice. But she's not thinking about the Iron Throne here at all. It doesn't come to her mind at all in this chapter. She's just all about this birthing the dragons, and taking the Iron Throne back is that idea kind of gets mashed together, but it's not justice. It is more revenge and power and what all that means. It's so much power, too much power. That's kind of what I'm saying here. No one can handle that much power. It's a great way to end a book, a fantastic way to hook an audience and to launch a fandom. It's just, whew.
Set the world on a fire.
A flame on fire.
Yeah, a flame, a fire. I don't know.
One of the questions that we're gonna ask next week is how much this lines up with the Azor Ahai prophecy. Is Drogo Nissa? What are the 3 lives here? If it's a death must pay for life, well, we have Drogo and Mirri. Well, there were 3 eggs attached. Where's the 3rd one? Nina suggests Dany's willingness to offer herself as a sacrifice. Their total willingness, her total confidence might be the key, or a key. We'll discuss that idea and others in the Q&A. Something not really shown on TV is that, and I mentioned this briefly earlier in the episode, is that Dany has large amounts of Drogo's stuff put on his pyre, like clothes, tents, his saddles, other riding gear, his weapons, all that. That's kind of neat. Just a imagery of how much bigger and more ornate the pyre would have been. I think that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of treasures, she forgives Jorah, or if she forgives Jorah, as we see in the show, is she going to fulfill her promise to this promise, quote?
To get him a longsword like none the world has ever seen, dragon forged and made of Valyrian steel.
I, for one, would like to see this blade she speaks of some commenters wonder if it will, in fact, be Blackfire. I mean, how would Jorah get Blackfire? Well, let me tell you. If she slays the lie that is Fagon, and if Fagon is wielding Blackfire, which there's some evidence to suspect he will be given it or, quote, find it in a way that makes it look like it was divine in some way, well, if she defeats all that and he dies or, relinquishes Blackfire, well, maybe Jorah will wield it.
Which people might also wonder about Longclaw. Well, Longclaw isn't a long sword. Not that means he might not have gotten it somehow, but
yeah, you're right. Technically, it's a bastard sword, which is a little bit bigger. So yeah, if we're being technical.
If you're being technical, black, that's one of the reasons why Blackfire, I guess, would be a better fit.
Yeah, especially since the show touched on that too. Jon tried to give Longclaw back to Jordan. He's like, no. So maybe that's just a show thing. Could easily be just a show thing, especially given where that scene happens. But it could be something that happens. He could have his own "I don't want it" moment. All right, like I said, next time Q&A with Joe Buckley and Lady Gwyn, and like I said, also don't forget the Scraps and Scrolls podcast or episodes on his Isle of Faces podcast, which consists of additional thoughts on all the chapters we're covering here with Valar Rereadis. So, thanks to all of our patrons who make this possible. Without your support, we'd be doing something else. I don't know what we'd be doing, but we wouldn't be able to do this, so I'm eternally thankful for that. Thanks to Ashea for running all the production, wearing so many hats, having arms like a kraken, 10 different arms, doing so much. I don't know how she does it. Ashea's the best.
We're going to switch places one of these days. How about that?
That'll be a disaster. Not on your end. You'd be just fine in my spot.
Exactly. But I've talked about how I play an essential part. I am not easily replaceable in the slightest.
She is not.
He would need someone who can do live production, video editing, who also knows the material.
Yeah,
which is tough. Yes.
Yeah.
And who is here in Atlanta to boot.
Yep. No replacing you. No, not at all. Not happening.
But we're going to replace Aziz.
Shoot. Uh-oh. Is this a pyre? Am I sitting on a pyre right now?
Oh.
Thanks also to the History of Westeros mods who post the chapters in our Facebook group and lead discussion. And thanks to people who participate in those discussions. That is a big part of where a lot of the extra little observations we get in these chapters come from. And that will be a feature going forward for Clash of Kings when we get into that. Which will, by the way, be the week after we do the Q&A. So that would be September 29th. September 29th. Make sure that is when we'll be starting Clash of Kings. Can't wait for that. We'll have Stannis and Melisandre and all kinds of cool stuff like that. Thanks to Nina Friel for lots of thoughts this time and in general, and for helping us out with the timestamps on the videos. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld and his website, claridox.de, for the maps you see behind me, and for lots of other things, like helping us get this intro music from Kevin MacLeod that we use here. Some of you may have noticed that I have a wound on my nose. Well,
yeah.
I got into a fight with a couch. Yeah, a couch. You should see the couch. I beat it up. It got in one good shot on me, though. Also, thanks to Jesse Koval and Jesse Townsend for our regular History of Westeros intro and outro music. And, well, that's it. I hope you guys have enjoyed our jaunt through book 1. It's only 1 book out of 5. We got a lot more to go. Can't wait for all that. This ride's been really fun, but it's just getting started. So, in the meantime, maybe get started with Clash or prepare yourself for it, however you want to do it. Start listening, start rereading. Either way, get on it. Valar Rereadis. Can't wait, y'all. See you next time.